They say a father's love knows no absolute bounds. They say a real man would gladly give the very shirt off his back to keep his children warm against the bitter cold of the world. But I gave much more than just a shirt. I gave my life savings. I gave the roof over my head. I gave my absolute unyielding trust to the boy I raised from a baby. I thought I was saving him from total financial ruin, but the chilling truth I am about to tell you will make you stop and question the very people sitting across from you at your own dinner table. If you truly believe blood is thicker than water, I need you to take a deep breath. Because what I did to my own flesh and blood in the span of 24 hours was not an act of blind anger or petty revenge. It was the coldest, most absolute form of justice. My name is Roland. I am 65 years old, and I spent 40 long, grueling years working as a city bus dispatcher in Chicago. I spent my entire life making sure my family never had to stand out in the freezing rain. Until the night my own son decided otherwise. The rain was coming down in heavy, blinding sheets that Tuesday night. It was the kind of torrential downpour that turns the city streets into rushing rivers and makes the yellow streetlights blur into smeared, glowing halos. I was driving my old pickup truck making my way back from a late-night pharmacy run. My beautiful wife, Sarah, is 62 years old, and her body is failing her. She suffers from severe stage 4 kidney failure. She requires constant intensive care, daily medications, and a portable dialysis machine just to keep her fragile system going from one sunrise to the next. That night, the local pharmacy in our neighborhood was completely out of her specific blood pressure medication. So I had driven clear across town in the middle of a massive thunderstorm to get the prescription filled at a 24-hour clinic. My large calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as my eyes squinted through the rhythmic, frantic sweep of the windshield wipers. The heater in the truck was blowing warm air, but I could still feel the deep chill of the Chicago night in my bones. All I wanted in the world was to get back to the warmth of our house, give Sarah her medicine, and sit quietly by her bed to hold her hand until she fell asleep. I turned the heavy steering wheel, and the thick tires of my truck splashed violently into our long driveway. As the bright beams of my headlights swept across the manicured front yard and hit the concrete porch, my right foot slammed down on the brake pedal so incredibly hard the truck jerked to a violent halt. The transmission groaned, but I did not care. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I could not comprehend the horrific scene I was looking at. There on the uncovered portion of the front porch, directly under the merciless freezing rain, was a wheelchair. Sitting in that wheelchair, soaked to the absolute bone, was my wife. I threw the truck into park, left the engine roaring, and leaped out into the violent storm. I did not even stop to grab my thick jacket. I sprinted across the flooded lawn, my boots splashing through deep puddles, yelling her name over the sound of the thunder. When I reached the porch, the sight of her nearly brought me to my knees. Sarah was shivering so violently, her entire fragile body was shaking the metal frame of the wheelchair. Her thin floral nightgown was plastered to her skin, and her lips had turned a terrifying, sickly shade of blue. She was clutching her thin arms around her chest, trying desperately to preserve whatever tiny fraction of body heat she had left. Right beside the wheels of her chair, sitting in muddy puddles of rainwater, were 3 black plastic trash bags. They were stuffed haphazardly with her clothes, her slippers, and her daily medical supplies. I fell to my knees on the hard, wet concrete and wrapped my large arms around her freezing shoulders. I asked her what happened. I asked her what in the name of God she was doing out here in the middle of a thunderstorm. Sarah looked at me with eyes so incredibly full of despair, humiliation, and pure heartbreak that it shattered my soul into a million jagged pieces. Through fiercely chattering teeth and heavy, breathless sobs, she told me the most horrific thing a father could ever hear. Our son Kevin and his wife Jessica had pushed her out the front door and locked the deadbolt behind her. They had literally rolled a sick, dying 62-year-old black woman out into a freezing storm and left her there like a bag of garbage. I wiped the freezing rain from Sarah's face, begging her to tell me why. I asked her what could have possibly happened in the 45 minutes I was gone to justify this madness. Her answer felt like a physical, heavy blow to my stomach. Kevin and Jessica were hosting a fancy, elegant dinner party upstairs with Jessica's brother Todd. Todd is a slick-talking, arrogant real estate broker, and Jessica is a privileged white woman who always looked down her nose at the humble way Sarah and I lived our lives. Sarah told me that the steady, rhythmic humming noise from her portable dialysis machine was bothering them. Jessica had actually come downstairs with a glass of wine in her hand and complained that the medical machine keeping my wife alive was ruining the upscale ambiance of their dinner party. Instead of defending his own mother, the woman who gave him life and raised him with every ounce of love and devotion in her heart, Kevin agreed with his wife. He stood by and watched as Jessica and Todd packed her clothes into garbage bags. Then Kevin, my own flesh and blood, grabbed the handles of her wheelchair, rolled her out into the harsh, freezing elements, and locked the heavy mahogany door. A fiery, blinding rage ignited deep in the center of my chest. It was a heat so intense I could no longer feel the freezing rain soaking my shirt. I stood up and marched straight to that heavy wooden front door. I pounded my fists against the thick wood so hard my knuckles instantly began to throb and bleed. I shouted for Kevin to open the door immediately. I screamed his name over the roaring thunder, demanding he come face me like a man. But all I heard in response was the faint, muffled sound of smooth jazz music and clinking crystal wine glasses floating down from the second-floor dining room. They were ignoring me. They were sipping expensive champagne and laughing with their wealthy guest, while the woman who birthed him was freezing to death on the welcome mat. As I beat my bloody hands against the locked door, the sheer monumental audacity of their betrayal washed over me. This was not just any house. This was the house I bought. This roof belonged to me. For 40 long years, I worked the grueling graveyard shifts at the Chicago Transit Depot. I dispatched buses in blinding blizzards and suffocating heat waves on major holidays, and on weekends when other fathers were resting. I missed family dinners and Sunday church services just to save every extra dime I could possibly scrape together. I sacrificed my own body and my own youth so Kevin could go to a good private school, so he could walk with his head held high in society and never have to struggle the way I did. And a year ago, when Kevin came to me crying like a desperate, terrified child, I sacrificed my entire future for him too. He had sat in our old living room weeping uncontrollably about how his investment fund had completely collapsed. He told me he was $92,000 in debt and that the bank was going to foreclose on his entire life. He said he was going to lose his business, his marriage, and his freedom. Like any father who deeply loves his son, I did not hesitate for a single second. I went straight to the bank and I drained exactly $92,000 from my hard-earned retirement savings. I wiped out my entire 401k to pull my son out of the fire. I used that money to buy this beautiful, massive house outright. I made sure my name remained as the primary owner on the deed and the mortgage documents to protect my lifelong investment, but I gladly allowed Kevin and Jessica to live in the spacious, luxurious upstairs master suites. I only asked for one single thing in return: a simple, modest room on the ground floor where Sarah could rest safely and use her medical equipment in peace. I handed them the keys to the kingdom, and they rewarded me by throwing my sick queen into the moat. I kicked the heavy door, my wet work boots leaving muddy scuff marks on the pristine white paint. The freezing rain was blinding me, mixing with the hot, furious tears of absolute betrayal streaming down my face. I yelled at the top of my lungs that I held the primary deed to this property, I yelled that they were sleeping under a roof paid for by my broken back and my empty retirement account. But the door remained shut tight against me. The sheer disrespect was suffocating. I thought about the sunny days I carried Kevin on my broad shoulders at the city park when he was just a little boy. I thought about Sarah working 2 exhausting jobs when he was a toddler, just so we could afford to buy him the brand new sneakers he begged for. We poured our entire existence, our blood, our sweat, and our souls into making him a strong, honorable man. And this was the man he ultimately chose to become, a weak, spineless coward who would let his snobby, entitled wife and her arrogant brother throw a sick, elderly black woman into a freezing storm because her life support machine was too noisy for their elegant dinner party. I only stopped pounding on the door when I heard Sarah let out a weak, terrifyingly ragged cough behind me. I turned around quickly and saw that she was slumped over in her wet wheelchair, barely conscious. The severe cold was rapidly overtaking her fragile, compromised immune system. I knew if I stayed there fighting with a piece of wood, I was going to lose my wife tonight. I turned my back to the locked door and looked up at the large second-floor window. Through the thick, heavy curtain of falling rain, I saw them. 2 silhouettes standing clearly in the warm, glowing golden light of the upstairs dining room. It was Kevin and Jessica. They were standing there shoulder to shoulder, holding their delicate wine glasses, looking down at me and my dying wife. For a long, dreadful, agonizing second, my son and I locked eyes through the rain-slicked glass. There was absolutely no remorse in his posture. There was no guilt in his face. He just stood there next to his wealthy wife, staring coldly at the miserable, desperate scene he had created on his own front lawn. And then, with a slow, deliberate, and incredibly cruel motion, Jessica reached out her hand and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, blocking us out completely. In that exact fraction of a second, something deep inside my soul died forever. The devoted father who had unconditionally loved that boy, the hard-working man who had sacrificed his entire retirement, the forgiving parent who had constantly made excuses for his son's flaws, that man vanished permanently into the freezing rain. What replaced him was something entirely different. A cold, terrifying, and absolutely calculating, icy rage took over my entire being. My chest tightened not with the heavy weight of sorrow, but with the absolute blinding clarity of a man who knows exactly what he has to do next. I did not yell anymore. I did not shed another single tear. The time for pleading was over. I walked back over to Sarah, scooped her freezing, fragile body gently into my large arms, and carried her quickly to the passenger seat of my truck. I placed her carefully on the seat, turned the heater up as high as it would possibly go, and wrapped my thick, dry work jacket tightly around her shaking shoulders. I threw the heavy bags of her belongings into the truck bed. I climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and threw the truck violently into gear. I sped away from the house, my tires tearing through the flooded suburban streets as I raced toward the emergency room. I was going to do everything in my power to save my wife tonight. But by tomorrow morning, the ungrateful boy I raised was going to learn the most devastating and permanent lesson of his miserable life. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency room flew open, and I burst through the entrance, carrying my wife like a fragile, broken porcelain doll. The sterile, blinding white lights of the hospital hallway burned my eyes, but I did not slow down. I screamed for a doctor at the top of my lungs. My voice echoed off the cold linoleum floors, hoarse and cracking, with a kind of primal, absolute terror I had never experienced in my entire 65 years of life. A team of nurses rushed forward immediately, pushing a rolling gurney toward me. I laid Sarah down as gently as my trembling hands would allow. Her body was still convulsing violently from the freezing rain, and her breathing had been reduced to a terrifying, shallow, wet rattle that sounded like drowning. They whisked her away through a set of heavy double doors, shouting medical codes to one another that I did not fully understand. But the sheer frantic urgency in their voices told me everything I needed to know. I tried to follow them into the trauma bay, but a heavy-set security guard gently but firmly put a hand flat against my chest, telling me I had to stay behind the red line. I stood there completely paralyzed, dripping wet, leaving a dark puddle of rainwater and mud on the immaculate floor, watching the absolute love of my life disappear behind the swinging doors. A young doctor with exhausted, hollow eyes came out into the waiting area an agonizing hour later. That single hour felt like a dark, endless decade trapped at the bottom of the ocean. He pulled me aside and delivered the news with a grim, incredibly serious expression. Sarah had developed severe double pneumonia from her exposure to the brutal storm. For a healthy person, that diagnosis is a grueling battle. But for a 62-year-old woman with stage 4 kidney failure, it was a catastrophic life-or-death crisis. Her compromised immune system was already fighting a daily losing war just to filter toxins from her fragile bloodstream. Now her lungs were rapidly filling with fluid. The doctor told me, looking directly into my eyes, that the next 24 hours would absolutely determine if she survived. They had to put her on a mechanical ventilator to push oxygen into her failing lungs and start a regimen of aggressive intravenous antibiotics, while desperately trying not to completely overload her shutting-down kidneys. It was a terrifying, delicate medical balancing act. He placed a sympathetic, heavy hand on my wet shoulder and told me I needed to prepare myself for the worst possible outcome. I collapsed into one of those hard, unforgiving plastic chairs in the desolate waiting room. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed above me, a persistent, aggressive buzzing sound that clawed at my pounding headache. The sharp chemical smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol turned my stomach into tight, painful knots. My clothes were still completely damp, clinging to my skin with an uncomfortable, icy chill, but I could not feel the physical cold of the room anymore. The only cold I felt was a deep, dark, freezing void rapidly expanding inside the center of my chest. I buried my face heavily in my large, calloused hands. My massive fingers, the exact same fingers that had turned countless heavy wrenches, fixed endless broken pipes around our old house, and held my tiny son's hand on his very first day of kindergarten, were trembling violently. I was terrified. I was absolutely paralyzed by the suffocating fear of losing Sarah. She was my rock, my ultimate compass. The gentle, beautiful soul who stood faithfully by my side when we had nothing but a bare mattress on the floor and a glass jar of loose change to pay the winter heating bill. Now she was fighting for her very last breath, hooked up to a dozen terrifying machines, all because she had been callously discarded like a piece of unwanted trash. My mind began to race violently, trying desperately to process the sheer monstrous cruelty of what had just occurred. I kept seeing that heavy mahogany front door. I kept hearing the faint, arrogant sound of smooth jazz music drifting from the upstairs dining room. But most of all, I kept seeing the dark silhouette of my son Kevin standing in the warm, glowing light of the second-floor window right next to his snobbish, entitled wife, Jessica. I saw him look down at his sick mother freezing to death in a wheelchair and do absolutely nothing. I watched him stand perfectly still and allow his wife to pull the heavy velvet curtains shut. How does a human being do that? How does a man, a son, look directly at the woman who gave him life and close the curtains on her agonizing suffering? I felt my teeth grind together so intensely hard my jaw physically ached. This was not some random, violent stranger who had attacked my wife in a dark city alley. This was the boy we had poured our entire existence into. This was the man who looked me in the eye and called me Dad. The sheer monumental betrayal of it defied every single law of nature and morality I had ever known. A heavy, suffocating wave of disbelief washed over me closely, followed by an intensely bitter, burning anger that threatened to consume my sanity. I sat alone in that desolate, quiet waiting room, and the memories of the past 35 years flooded my exhausted mind like a violently broken dam. I remembered working those brutal graveyard shifts at the Chicago Transit Depot. During the absolute worst winters when the heavy snow piled up past the knees and the vicious wind coming off Lake Michigan cut right through your bones like a knife, I was out there. I would eagerly volunteer for double shifts, working 16 hours straight, breathing in toxic diesel fumes, and dealing with angry frozen commuters. Why did I do it? Because I was a black father fiercely determined to make sure my son never felt less than anybody else in this harsh world. I wanted Kevin to walk into his classrooms with his head held high, shoulders back, and confident. I remembered saving for 3 grueling months working overtime every single weekend just to buy him those ridiculously expensive brand-name basketball sneakers he begged for in the 7th grade. I wore heavy work boots with holes in the soles patched up with silver duct tape so my boy could run down the court looking like $1,000,000. Sarah did the exact same thing. She worked at a sweltering dry cleaner, pressing heavy shirts until her hands blistered raw from the industrial steam, just to pay for his private math tutoring. We desperately wanted him to have the perfect vocabulary, the perfect refined manners, the perfect opportunities. We worked ourselves to the bone to shield him from the harsh, ugly realities of the world. We took every heavy blow, every financial hardship, every sleepless, anxious night upon ourselves, so Kevin could have a smooth, neatly paved road to success. We taught him the value of deep respect. We taught him to always honor his elders. We taught him the supreme value of family loyalty and faith. We gave him every single tool a man needs to be decent and good. And yet somehow, somewhere along the line, all that massive sacrifice had twisted into something incredibly ugly. It bred a toxic entitlement I completely failed to recognize until it was far too late. I genuinely thought providing for him financially and making his life effortlessly easy was the ultimate expression of a father's love. But sitting in that hospital chair looking back at the past, I realized that smoothing out every single bump in the road meant Kevin never learned how to handle real adversity. He never learned the true agonizing weight of sacrifice. When he started dating and eventually married Jessica, I saw the stark changes, but I constantly made excuses for him. I told myself he was just trying to fit into her affluent, privileged world. I completely ignored how he started correcting Sarah's grammar at the Sunday dinner table. I turned a blind eye when he abruptly stopped coming to our small neighborhood church, because Jessica found the congregation too loud and unrefined. I swallowed my heavy pride when they had their lavish, expensive wedding and deliberately sat us at a table near the swinging kitchen doors, far away from her wealthy, connected family. I excused every bit of disrespect because I loved my son, and I desperately wanted peace in our family. But peace is a devastating lie when it is built entirely on disrespect. That truth was hitting me now with the brutal force of a runaway freight train. When Kevin came to me weeping about his $92,000 debt, crying hysterically that his life was completely over, I did not let him face the harsh consequences of his reckless actions. I swooped in to save him yet again. I walked into my bank and handed over the entire contents of my retirement fund, the singular safety net I had meticulously built through decades of sweat and aching joints. I bought that massive, luxurious house in my name just to keep a solid roof over his head. And how exactly did he repay that monumental lifeline? He allowed his wife and her arrogant, slimy brother Todd to treat me and his mother like an embarrassing insect infestation. He let them banish his desperately sick mother to a freezing, rain-swept porch because her life-saving medical machinery was a mild inconvenience to their high society dinner party. I looked down at my hands resting on my knees. The deep, permanent creases in my palms were heavily stained with the grease and grime of a lifetime of honest, hard labor. These hands had built his entire world from the ground up. These hands had lifted him up every time he stumbled. And tonight, those exact same hands had to carry his dying, freezing mother out of the pouring rain. The grief and fear inside me began to solidify rapidly, shifting from a wild, chaotic emotional storm into a hardened, razor-sharp blade. I was no longer just a heartbroken, grieving father. I was a man who suddenly realized he had unknowingly funded his own destruction. I had literally armed and housed the very enemies who had just tried to kill my wife. The hospital waiting room was eerily quiet except for the steady, rhythmic ticking of a large round clock on the white wall. Every single tick felt like a heavy steel hammer striking an anvil inside my skull. Every passing, agonizing minute was another moment Sarah was fighting for her very life in a sterile room completely alone. I stood up and paced the length of the long hallway, my heavy wet boots squeaking softly against the highly polished floor. I desperately needed to move. I needed to channel this explosive, furious energy coursing fiercely through my veins. The horrific image of those velvet curtains closing kept playing on a continuous, agonizing loop in my brain. Kevin and Jessica safe in their warm, expensive clothes, sipping vintage wine while my Sarah turned blue in the cold mud. I walked over to the large glass window at the far end of the corridor and looked out into the dark Chicago night. The storm was still raging violently outside, the heavy rain lashing relentlessly against the thick glass. The city looked incredibly harsh and unforgiving. I realized right then that I had spent 35 long years aggressively protecting Kevin from this exact harshness, but I had completely failed to protect Sarah from Kevin. I had let my blind, unwavering devotion to my son blind me to the absolute monster he was rapidly becoming. I had allowed him to manipulate and weaponize my love, but that toxic cycle ended tonight. I promised myself, right there staring into the stormy, pitch-black darkness, that if Sarah somehow survived this horrific ordeal, things were going to change permanently and ruthlessly. I was not going to be the silent stepping stone for their unearned luxury anymore. I was not going to play the pathetic role of the quiet, accommodating old man hiding away in the downstairs bedroom just so I would not embarrass my polished, wealthy son. I held the primary legal deed to that massive house. It was my property. It was my hard-earned money that bought every single brick and every single shingle on that roof. Son. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. They thought they had successfully and easily disposed of the only annoying obstacle standing in the way of their perfect, wealthy lifestyle. They severely underestimated the cold, calculating resolve of a man who has absolutely nothing left to lose and everything in the world to fight for. The deep physical exhaustion in my bones was completely eclipsed by an intense, burning adrenaline. I did not know yet exactly how I was going to tear down the false, luxurious kingdom they had built on my broken back, but I knew the entire foundation was going to crumble into dust. I was going to violently reclaim my dignity. I was going to secure absolute justice for the woman lying on a ventilator a few doors down. I was going to make sure my son learned the true devastating cost of betrayal. I was staring blankly at the scuffed linoleum tiles of the hospital floor when a sudden heavy vibration against my right leg startled me. My smartphone was buzzing relentlessly deep inside the damp pocket of my jeans. At first, I simply wanted to ignore it. The entire universe had narrowed down to the steady mechanical breathing of the ventilator, keeping my Sarah alive behind those heavy double doors. I did not care who was trying to reach me in the middle of a freezing storm. But the phone vibrated again. It was a short, rapid double pulse. That was not a standard phone call or a random text message. That was a highly specific custom alert. Months ago, long before this absolute nightmare ever started to unfold, I had spent a quiet Saturday morning wiring a discreet state-of-the-art smart home security system throughout our entire property. I did it because some old buddies from the transit depot had warned me about a recent string of aggressive suburban burglaries in our area. I wanted to make sure Sarah was always perfectly safe whenever I had to run to the pharmacy or the grocery store. I bought tiny high-definition cameras equipped with crystal-clear audio recording capabilities and tucked them seamlessly into the crown, molding the bookshelf edges and the dark, shadowed corners of our living room. Kevin and Jessica never noticed a single wire. They constantly treated me like some clueless, obsolete old man who still struggled to program a television remote. They assumed my generation had simply aged out of understanding modern technology. That arrogant, condescending assumption was about to become the single greatest fatal mistake of their miserable lives. I pulled the heavy phone from my pocket. The bright screen displayed a push notification from the primary living room camera indicating motion detected. I tapped the glass screen with my thumb, and the secure live feed loaded instantly in crisp, high-definition color. The sight that greeted my tired, bloodshot eyes made the remaining breath vanish entirely from my lungs. The small screen showed the spacious, luxurious expanse of my own living room. A warm fire was crackling invitingly in the massive stone fireplace. It was a sickening, horrifying contrast to the freezing rain outside and the sterile, terrifying hospital corridor where I currently sat shivering. Lounging on the expensive Italian leather sectional sofa were my son Kevin, his wife Jessica, and her slick older brother Todd. They were not panicked. They were not worried about the dying 62-year-old woman they had just banished into a severe thunderstorm. Instead, Todd was leaning back deeply into the cushions with his expensive designer shoes kicked up casually on my mahogany coffee table. He was holding a heavy crystal glass filled with dark, expensive bourbon. I pressed the volume button on the side of my phone, holding the speaker close to my ear. The audio feed was perfectly clear. Todd let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed violently through my phone. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his bourbon and pointed his glass directly toward my son. I could hear every single devastating syllable. Todd told Kevin he could not believe they finally had the guts to toss the sick old bat out into the street. Those were his exact words. The sick old bat. My beautiful Sarah, the proud, hard-working woman who had scrubbed floors and pressed heavy shirts until her fingers bled to put hot food on our table, was nothing but a crude punchline to this parasite. I waited for my son to stand up. I waited for Kevin to defend the honor of his mother, to punch Todd directly in his smug, privileged face. But Kevin just swirled the amber liquid in his own glass and chuckled. He actually chuckled. Kevin leaned forward and told Todd they had to do it because her depressing medical equipment was dragging down their property value. My mind completely halted. Property value. I stared at the small screen, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of their conversation. Then Todd smiled a predatory wide grin, displaying his perfectly white teeth. He told them they needed to celebrate properly tonight, because he had 3 highly motivated cash buyers scheduled to tour the property next Wednesday. Buyers. How could Todd possibly have buyers for a house he did not own? My name was the primary signature on the official county deed. I held the absolute legal title to the property. Before I could even process that layered absolute betrayal, Jessica chimed in. She rested her manicured hand on her brother's shoulder and praised his absolute financial genius. She looked at Kevin and told him that bringing Todd in to handle their money problems was the best decision they ever made. Todd puffed out his chest with sheer, unadulterated arrogance. He started bragging loudly about how incredibly easy it had been to set up the dummy limited liability company in Delaware. He boasted about creating the fake foreclosure notices, the expertly forged bank letters, and the completely fabricated bankruptcy filings. A massive heavy boulder dropped directly into the pit of my stomach. Every single drop of warm blood in my body turned to pure, freezing ice. There was no bankruptcy. There was no failed investment fund. The terrifying financial ruin Kevin had wept about in my living room a year ago was a carefully engineered, highly orchestrated illusion. The $92,000 I had drained from my Transit Union retirement account, the money I had sacrificed my entire future to give him, had never gone to a bank to save his life. It went directly into an anonymous shell company controlled entirely by Todd. They had stolen my life savings. My own flesh and blood had looked me dead in the eyes, squeezed out fake, desperate tears, and robbed me blind. The physical pain in my chest was so intense I had to grip the hard plastic armrests of my hospital chair, just to keep from falling onto the floor. I remembered the exact day I went to the bank to authorize the wire transfer. I remembered the bank teller looking at me asking if I was absolutely sure I wanted to drain my penalty-free retirement funds. I had smiled proudly and told her it was to save my son. I had breathed in toxic bus fumes in the freezing Chicago winters for 40 years so this boy could have a secure future. And he had used my unwavering, unconditional father's love as a weapon to strip me bare. On the video feed, Kevin smiled a greedy, sickening smile. He told Todd that the old man was a pathetically soft target. He said I was so desperate to be the big, strong protector of the family name that I handed over the cash without demanding a single lawyer look at the paperwork. He mocked my pride. He mocked my lifelong dedication to keeping my family safe. Every vicious word out of his mouth was like a rusted blade turning slowly in my gut. He told his wife and his brother-in-law that black fathers of my generation carry so much historical guilt about providing for their children that they will literally empty their own pockets just to feel respected. He sat in my house drinking my liquor and analyzed my deepest paternal instincts like a cold, clinical predator. But the betrayal was already absolute, and the depth of their pure evil was still not finished. Jessica poured herself another glass of red wine and asked Kevin if he was fully prepared for tomorrow morning. Todd leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and outlined the final phase of their monstrous master plan. He told Kevin to go to the hospital first thing in the morning. He instructed my son to put on his best emotional performance to act completely devastated and tearfully apologetic about kicking Sarah out into the storm. Todd reached into his tailored designer jacket and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers. He tossed them casually onto the coffee table. He explained that hidden right in the middle of a stack of fake hospital liability waivers and dummy medical insurance forms was a fully drafted, legally binding quitclaim deed. A legal document that would completely and permanently transfer my primary ownership of the property over to Kevin. Todd told my son that I would be so exhausted, so emotionally broken, and entirely distracted by Sarah's critical condition that I would blindly sign anything he put in front of me just to make the immediate headache go away. Once my signature was on that paper, the house was legally and irreversibly theirs. Kevin laughed out loud and said the second the ink was dry on the deed, they were going to accept the highest cash offer Todd could find. Jessica clapped her hands together excitedly, talking about the luxury waterfront condo they had already picked out and put a hold on in Miami, Florida. They talked about the ocean views, the marble countertops, and the exclusive neighborhood, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching their every single move. And then my son delivered the final, ultimate death blow. Todd asked what they were going to do with me and Sarah once the house was sold and the cash was cleared into their accounts. Kevin took a slow sip of his bourbon and shrugged with a chilling, terrifying indifference. He said they would just let the state handle us. He said they would drop us off at the cheapest underfunded public hospice facility in the county, change their phone numbers, and block us completely. They were going to leave the woman who birthed him and the man who financed his entire life to die alone in poverty, while they drank margaritas on a white sand beach funded by my broken back. The live feed continued to stream, showing them cheerfully clinking their expensive crystal glasses together in a celebratory toast to their newfound wealth. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. The busy, chaotic hospital corridor around me seemed to fade into absolute dead silence. The harsh, aggressive buzzing of the fluorescent lights vanished. The frantic beeping of the cardiac monitors in the nearby trauma rooms faded away into nothingness. There was only the cold, steady, rhythmic pounding of my own heart echoing in my ears. Just a few minutes ago, I had been a terrified, weeping old man, praying desperately for a medical miracle. Now sitting in the harsh, sterile light of the emergency room, a completely different entity took over my soul. The shock evaporated completely from my mind. The deep, agonizing sorrow burned away, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated, cold resolve. They thought I was a foolish, clueless relic from a forgotten generation. They thought my profound love for my family was a fatal weakness they could easily and safely exploit. They had mistaken my lifelong quiet sacrifice for stupidity. I looked down at my rough, permanently scarred hands. These hands had safely dispatched thousands of heavy city buses through the most dangerous, blinding blizzards in Chicago history. These hands had meticulously built a secure life from absolute scratch, navigating a world designed to keep a black man down. I knew exactly how to navigate a storm. I knew exactly how to direct heavy machinery. And right now I was looking at a disastrous high-speed collision course, engineered by my own son. Kevin, Jessica, and Todd thought they had orchestrated the perfect, flawless crime. They were sitting in my house drinking my liquor, completely convinced they had already won the war. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the exact detailed blueprint of their own absolute destruction. I locked my phone screen, plunging the display into darkness, and slipped the device back into my damp pocket. I did not shed another single tear. The grieving, heartbroken father was dead. The time for mourning and making excuses was permanently over. I sat back in the hard plastic chair, crossed my arms over my chest, and prepared for war. The sun crept over the concrete skyline of Chicago, casting long, pale rays of morning light through the horizontal blinds of the intensive care unit. Wednesday morning arrived with a brutal, unforgiving chill. I had not slept a single second. I sat rigidly in the uncomfortable vinyl chair placed directly beside my wife's hospital bed, my eyes burning with a dry, gritty exhaustion. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator forcing oxygen into Sarah's frail lungs was the only sound anchoring me to reality. The doctors had stabilized her during the darkest hours of the night, but they made it absolutely clear that she was still balancing precariously on the razor-thin edge between life and death. Her skin lacked its usual warm brown glow, replaced by an ashen, terrifying pallor. The heavy plastic tubes snaking across her chest and arms looked like cruel, unnatural vines trying to pull her away from me. I spent those agonizing pre-dawn hours staring at her beautiful, peaceful face, reflecting on the absolute nightmare I had uncovered just hours before. The security camera footage I had watched on my phone was burned permanently into my mind. I could still hear the arrogant, wealthy laughter of my daughter-in-law's brother Todd. I could still see my own son Kevin sitting on my Italian leather sofa, casually sipping expensive bourbon, while plotting to steal my home and dump his freezing, dying mother into a state-run hospice. The sheer magnitude of their calculated evil was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted the sharp, metallic tang of my own blood just to keep from screaming out loud in that quiet hospital room. Right around 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy wooden door to the intensive care room slowly pushed open. The hinges let out a soft, metallic whine. I did not turn my head immediately. I knew exactly who it was before he even stepped fully into the room. I could hear the distinct, confident click of expensive leather designer shoes stepping onto the sterile linoleum floor. It was a sound that absolutely did not belong in a place of sickness and desperate prayers. I slowly turned my neck, my muscles stiff and aching from the freezing rain I had endured the night before. There stood my son. Kevin walked into the room wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was meticulously styled, and a faint waft of premium spicy cologne cut through the sharp chemical smell of hospital bleach. He looked like a successful morning executive. He looked exactly like the polished, refined man Sarah and I had broken our backs to raise. But looking at him now, knowing the dark, putrid truth hidden behind his expensive clothes, I felt a wave of absolute, violently churning nausea rise in my throat. In his left hand, Kevin held a small, pathetic bouquet of flowers. They were cheap, wilted yellow daisies wrapped in crinkling, clear plastic, the kind you grab as an afterthought from a gas station checkout counter on your way to somewhere you do not really want to be. In his right hand, gripped tightly against his side, was a thick, heavy manila folder. He approached the bed with slow, measured steps, putting on a masterful, deeply disturbing performance of a concerned son. He contorted his face into a mask of profound sorrow, dropping his shoulders and letting out a shaky, dramatic sigh. If I had not seen him laughing and toasting his whiskey glass the night before, I would have believed he was genuinely heartbroken. That was the most terrifying realization of all. My son was a spectacular, flawless liar. Kevin placed the cheap, plastic-wrapped daisies on the rolling tray table next to Sarah's bed. He did not lean down to kiss her forehead. He did not reach out to touch her hand. He kept a safe, sterile distance from the woman who had sacrificed her entire youth to make sure he never went to bed hungry. He turned his gaze toward me, narrowing his eyes to convey a deeply manufactured sympathy. He spoke in a soft, hushed tone that made my skin crawl with pure disgust. He told me he came as quickly as he could. He said he had been up all night sick with worry about his mother. Every single syllable that fell from his lips was coated in a thick, sugary layer of absolute deceit. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting heavily on my thighs, my face an unreadable mask of stone. I let him talk. I needed to hear exactly how far he was willing to take this horrific charade. Kevin pulled a chair up close to mine and sat down, leaning forward, invading my space with his expensive cologne. He lowered his voice even further, adopting the smooth, practiced cadence of a corporate negotiator trying to close a difficult deal. He told me that last night was a massive, terrible misunderstanding. He looked me dead in the eyes and lied with breathtaking ease. He claimed that Jessica was simply trying to help Sarah get some fresh air on the porch because the house felt stuffy. He spun a ridiculous, insulting fable about how the heavy front door must have accidentally blown shut in the wind, locking the deadbolt from the inside by mistake. He said the music in the dining room was simply too loud for them to hear her knocking. He swore to me, placing his manicured hand over his heart, that they had absolutely no idea she was stranded out in the freezing storm until the police drove by hours later. Listening to him speak, I could hear the unmistakable, arrogant influence of Todd bleeding through every single word. Todd had coached him. Todd had fed him these exact corporate liability-dodging phrases to ensure I would not call the authorities and press charges for elder abuse. Kevin was reciting a carefully drafted script designed to pacify a foolish, ignorant old man. The sheer audacity of his lie was staggering. He was looking at my worn, tired face and banking entirely on my paternal love to blind me to the truth. He truly believed I was nothing more than a gullible, uneducated former bus dispatcher who would accept any crumb of affection he threw my way. I kept my expression completely neutral, though my heart was hammering against my ribs with the force of a freight train. I slowly nodded my head, giving him the exact reaction he was desperately looking for. I watched the tense, nervous muscles in his jaw instantly relax. A brief, fleeting glimmer of triumph flashed in his eyes. He thought he had me. He thought the bridge was secure and it was time to cross over and take the prize. Kevin smoothly transitioned to the real reason he had come to the hospital. He shifted his weight in the chair and brought the thick manila folder up to his lap. His tone changed from fake sorrow to urgent businesslike efficiency. He let out another heavy sigh, acting as though the weight of the world was resting entirely on his shoulders. He told me that he had just spoken with the hospital administration down in the billing department. He said the situation was incredibly complicated because of Sarah's advanced kidney failure and the highly specialized mechanical ventilator they had to use to keep her alive. He opened the manila folder with deliberate, practiced movements. Inside was a thick stack of complex, densely printed legal documents. The papers were not standard hospital forms. Even from a distance, my seasoned eyes could recognize the heavy premium stock paper used in real estate and municipal property transfers. Kevin pulled a sleek, expensive silver pen from the inner pocket of his suit jacket and placed it deliberately on top of the documents. He looked at me with an expression of intense, fabricated urgency. He told me that the hospital was threatening to stop Sarah's specialized intensive care treatments unless a comprehensive liability waiver and a secondary financial guarantor form were signed immediately. He used big, intimidating medical and legal terms, deliberately trying to overwhelm and confuse me. He said the hospital needed my primary signature to authorize the transfer of her medical debt so they could continue operating the dialysis machine alongside the ventilator. He pushed the open folder directly onto my lap. The heavy stack of papers rested against my jeans, feeling like a physical burning weight. I looked down at the documents. The top page was a standard generic hospital consent form, obviously printed off the internet, and slipped in as a decoy cover sheet. But my eyes immediately caught the edge of the second page protruding just beneath it. I saw the bold, unmistakable black lettering of a municipal header. It was the exact format used for property deeds in our county. Todd had expertly buried a legally binding quitclaim deed right in the middle of the fake medical paperwork. The trap was flawlessly designed. They knew I was terrified for my wife's life. They knew I had spent the last 12 hours sitting in a freezing, sterile corridor, praying to God for a miracle. They calculated with predatory precision that a desperate, exhausted husband would blindly sign anything put in front of him to ensure his wife received life-saving medical care. Todd had orchestrated the legal snare, and my own son had volunteered to deliver the fatal blow. Kevin tapped his manicured index finger against the edge of the silver pen, trying to inject a sense of frantic urgency into the silent room. He told me the doctors were waiting for the paperwork right now. He urged me to just sign the highlighted tabs at the bottom of the pages so he could run them down to the billing department and secure Sarah's treatment. He promised me, looking straight into my tired eyes, that he would handle all the confusing legal details so I could just focus entirely on being here with Mom. The profound, absolute evil sitting in the chair next to me was almost too massive to comprehend. I stared at the silver pen resting on the stack of forged, deceitful papers. My son was asking me to sign away the very roof over my head. He was asking me to hand over the absolute last remnant of my life's labor, the house I had purchased, with my completely drained retirement fund. And he was doing it while his mother lay suffocating on a machine just 3 feet away from him. He was trading our survival, our dignity, and our future for a luxury condo on a Florida beach with a woman who despised us. The silence in the intensive care room stretched out heavy and suffocating. The mechanical hiss of the ventilator seemed to grow louder, matching the intense rhythmic pounding of the blood in my ears. I kept my hands firmly by my sides, refusing to touch the sleek silver pen. I looked up slowly from the manila folder and fixed my gaze directly onto Kevin's face. I looked past the expensive suit, past the styled hair, and past the premium cologne. I looked deeply into the soul of the boy I had raised, searching desperately for even a single microscopic shred of the decent, honorable man I had tried to build. There was nothing there. The boy who used to ride on my shoulders, the boy who used to hold his mother's hand in church, was completely gone. In his place was a hollow, greedy stranger who viewed my unconditional love as nothing more than a financial vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Kevin leaned forward slightly, his facade of patience beginning to crack just a fraction. He nudged the manila folder closer to my chest, his eyes darting nervously toward the door and back to the papers. He whispered my name, calling me Dad, wrapping that sacred, beautiful word in a thick layer of venomous deceit. He asked me to please just pick up the pen and sign the papers so he could save Mom. He pushed the folder one last time, waiting eagerly for the exhausted, broken old man to surrender his entire kingdom. The weight of that sleek silver pen felt heavier than any steel wrench I had ever lifted during my 40 years at the transit depot. It lay there on top of the manila folder, shining under the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit, reflecting the absolute rot of the man sitting next to me. My son was waiting for me to pick it up. He was waiting for me to sign away the very foundation of my life so he could abandon his dying mother and me to the cold mercy of the state. A dark, violent energy coiled tightly in the center of my chest. My hands were resting on my faded denim jeans, and they began to shake. They were not shaking from the fatigue of a long, sleepless night. They were not trembling from the frailties of old age or the devastating sorrow of watching my beautiful wife fight for her life on a mechanical ventilator. My hands were shaking because it took every single ounce of physical and mental restraint I possessed not to reach across the narrow gap between our chairs, grab Kevin by his expensive silk tie, and throw him through the solid hospital wall. I wanted to stand up and scream the truth until the sterile windows shattered. I wanted to tear the forged quitclaim deed into 1,000 pieces and throw them directly into his arrogant, lying face. I wanted to tell him that I had watched him drinking my liquor and plotting my absolute ruin with his snobbish wife and her sleazy brother. The urge to destroy him right there in the middle of the medical ward was a living, breathing beast roaring in my ears. But I am a man who spent his entire life managing chaos. When you spend decades coordinating city buses through blinding Chicago blizzards and navigating a society that constantly underestimates you, you learn a very specific type of survival. You learn how to swallow your fury. You learn how to let the opposition believe they have the upper hand. If I lost my temper now, if I laid a single hostile hand on him, the hospital security would arrest me. I would be locked in a holding cell while Kevin walked away clean with the legal documents, and Sarah would be left completely defenseless. I could not let brute anger compromise the ultimate execution of absolute justice. I needed to outsmart the boy I had raised, so I took a slow, agonizingly deep breath. I channeled every drop of my righteous, furious rage and buried it deep beneath a carefully constructed, flawless facade. I forced my broad shoulders to slump forward. I let my spine curve, mimicking the posture of a man totally broken by the crushing weight of impending grief. I allowed the genuine shaking of my furious hands to look like the pathetic trembling of a helpless, exhausted senior citizen. I slowly pushed the manila folder an inch back across the plastic tray table. I lifted my hands and rubbed my face vigorously, pressing the heels of my palms deep into my tired eyes. I let out a long, ragged sigh that sounded like it was scraped from the very bottom of my empty lungs. When I finally looked back at Kevin, I made sure my eyes were wide, unfocused, and swimming with manufactured confusion. I told him in a weak, raspy voice that I simply could not do it right now. I stared at the highly complex legal text on the top page, squinting my eyes hard, as if the words were blurring together into a meaningless gray puddle. I told him my head was spinning too fast. I gestured weakly toward the terrifying tangle of transparent tubes and the rhythmic hissing of the medical machinery keeping his mother alive. I said the noise in the room was drilling a hole straight through my skull, and I could barely process my own name, let alone a dense stack of hospital liability paperwork. Kevin shifted in his seat. The expensive leather of his designer shoes squeaked slightly against the linoleum floor. I could see the sudden rigid tension locking up the muscles in his jaw. His perfect supportive sun mask slipped for a microscopic fraction of a second, revealing the greedy, panicked predator lurking just beneath the surface. He needed that signature today. He needed the ink to dry so Todd could finalize the sale with his anonymous cash buyers by next Wednesday. Florida and the millions of dollars were calling his name, and his exhausted old father was suddenly stalling the entire operation. He picked up the silver pen and tried to press it gently into my open palm. His voice dripped with a sickening, practiced sweetness that made my stomach churn. He told me it was just a standard formality. He leaned in closer, weaponizing his mother's critical condition against me with breathtaking cruelty. He whispered that the billing department was getting incredibly aggressive, and if I did not sign the guarantor forms right away, they might have to suspend Sarah's specialized dialysis treatments. He said he would just point to the dotted lines, and all I had to do was make a quick scribble. The sheer profound evil of his manipulation was staggering. He was actively threatening his own mother's life support, access to secure a real estate fraud. I kept my face totally blank, shielding the icy, calculating storm raging behind my eyes. I knew perfectly well the hospital was not threatening to stop her care. I knew the papers had absolutely nothing to do with medical insurance. But I had to play the terrified, confused old man to the absolute limit. I shook my head slowly, letting my trembling hands drop back down to my lap, entirely ignoring the pen he was trying to force upon me. I told him I forgot my reading glasses back at the house on the kitchen counter. I repeated that I could not read a single line of the tiny print, and he knew I never signed any legal document without my glasses. It was a firm boundary I had maintained my entire life, and using it now was the perfect logical excuse. I patted his knee with a fake, clumsy affection that made me want to wash my hands in boiling water. I told him to just leave the folder on the table. I promised him I would take it home, get a good night's sleep, put on my glasses, and sign everything this weekend when my mind was clear. Kevin stared at me. The silence in the small room grew thick and incredibly heavy. I could practically hear the frantic, desperate gears turning inside his head. He was trapped. He could not force a pen into my hand and physically make me write without blowing his cover completely. He could not scream at me or demand compliance because that would shatter his carefully crafted illusion of the deeply concerned and helpful son. He had banked everything on the assumption that my profound grief would make me compliant. He never anticipated that my stubborn old habits would act as a sudden impenetrable roadblock. He stared at the quitclaim deed sitting untouched on the tray table. A sharp, agitated breath escaped his nose. He tightly gripped the edge of his tailored suit jacket, trying desperately to regain his composure. He knew if he pushed me any harder right now, I might get suspicious and actually ask a nurse or a hospital administrator to come in and explain the paperwork to me. That would immediately expose the forged property transfer documents and trigger a massive criminal investigation before he even had a chance to leave the building. He had to retreat. He slowly pulled the silver pen back, slipping it into his jacket pocket. He forced his facial muscles to relax, pasting on a tight, entirely artificial smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He told me he understood. He said he knew this was an incredibly overwhelming day for me, and he did not want to add to my heavy stress. He patted my shoulder with a stiff, awkward motion. He told me to just take the folder home tonight, but he emphasized with a subtle, threatening edge to his voice that I needed to make sure it was signed and ready by Monday morning so Mom's treatment would not be interrupted. I nodded slowly, offering him a weak, exhausted smile in return. I told him he was a good son for taking care of all these confusing administrative headaches for me. The words tasted like bitter ash in my mouth, but I delivered them flawlessly. Kevin stood up, brushing an invisible speck of dust off his immaculate trousers. He looked over at the hospital bed where his mother lay fighting for oxygen. He did not say a word to her. He did not offer a single prayer or a gentle touch. He simply checked his expensive wristwatch turned on his heel and walked out of the intensive care unit. I sat perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic clicking of his designer shoes echoing down the long hospital corridor until the sound completely faded away. Only then did the heavy, slumped posture of the defeated old man vanish. My spine straightened like a steel rod. My trembling hands became rock solid. The exhaustion bleeding from my face was instantly replaced by a fierce, terrifying clarity. I stood up from the vinyl chair and walked over to the tray table. I picked up the manila folder and pulled out the thick stack of papers. I flipped past the fake hospital cover sheets, straight to the heavily printed document hidden in the center. The fraudulent quitclaim deed transferring my home, my entire life savings to a shell company controlled by Todd and my treacherous son. I stared at the blank signature line at the bottom of the page. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they were dealing with an obsolete, uneducated relic who would quietly surrender his kingdom and walk willingly into the slaughterhouse. They had no idea that I had just secured the exact physical evidence I needed to lock them all in a federal penitentiary. I carefully folded the forged documents and slid them deep into the inner pocket of my heavy work jacket. I turned around and looked down at my beautiful, fragile wife. The rhythmic hissing of the ventilator filled the quiet room. I reached out and gently stroked her cool forehead, making a silent, unbreakable vow to the woman I had loved for almost 4 decades. The trap had been successfully delayed. The enemy was retreating to their beach resort, believing they had won the war. But they had just handed the keys to their destruction directly to the man who built their world. The countdown had officially begun, and by the time this weekend was over, the kingdom they tried to steal would become their absolute permanent tomb. The heavy sliding doors of the intensive care unit closed behind me with a soft, definitive hiss, sealing my beautiful, fragile wife safely away from the monsters who wanted her dead. I stepped out of the sterile hospital lobby and into the brutal embrace of the Chicago morning. The torrential rain from the night before had finally reduced to a miserable freezing drizzle, but the sky remained a bruised, unforgiving shade of charcoal gray. I walked across the damp asphalt of the parking lot, my heavy work boots splashing through the puddles, but I did not feel the cold seeping through my socks. I did not feel the exhaustion of a man who had been awake for 36 agonizing hours. The only thing I felt was the burning physical weight of the forged quitclaim deed tucked deep inside the inner pocket of my jacket. It rested against my chest like a ticking bomb. I climbed into the cab of my old reliable pickup truck. The worn leather seat groaned under my weight. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned pale, staring out through the rain-streaked windshield at the sprawling concrete skyline of the city. For 40 grueling years, I had operated within the chaotic mechanical veins of this town. I was a city bus dispatcher. I spent decades sitting in cramped, suffocating control rooms, managing routes, dealing with broken-down engines, keeping drivers calm during blizzards, and fighting tooth and nail against a bureaucracy that viewed working-class black men as easily replaceable parts in a massive machine. I knew how to navigate hostile environments. I knew how to handle people who smiled in your face while actively plotting to strip you of your livelihood. I turned the ignition key and the heavy engine roared to life. I did not drive toward the suburbs. I did not drive toward the home my treacherous son was currently occupying. I steered the truck directly toward the gritty industrial heart of the South Loop. I needed a specific type of weapon for the war I was about to wage. I did not need a polite, polished corporate lawyer who billed by the hour to send strongly worded letters. I needed a shark. I needed a man who understood the raw, unvarnished brutality of the real world. I was heading to see Abraham Sterling. Abraham was a ruthless, old-school attorney who had served as the chief legal counsel for our transit union back in the late 90s. He was a man carved from pure granite, with a voice like grinding gravel and a mind like a steel trap. Back in the day, when the city administration tried to illegally slash our pensions and force us into predatory contracts, Abraham was the man who stood at the bargaining table and tore their expensive corporate lawyers to absolute pieces. He knew my grit, and I knew his. He was a man who despised bullies, predators, and anyone who tried to step on the necks of hardworking people. I parked my truck in a narrow alleyway behind an aging brick building. The paint on the exterior walls was peeling, and the neighborhood smelled of wet pavement and roasting coffee from a nearby diner. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and took the creaking elevator up to the 4th floor. Abraham's office was exactly as I remembered it from 20 years ago. It lacked the sleek, modern glass partitions and flashy abstract art of the downtown high-rises. Instead, it was lined with massive floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, groaning under the weight of thousands of thick legal volumes. The air smelled of old paper black coffee and worn leather. Abraham was sitting behind his massive, scarred oak desk. He was in his early 70s now, his hair completely silver, but his eyes were just as sharp and piercing as a hawk's. He looked up from a stack of case files as I walked through his door. He did not offer a wide, fake smile or empty pleasantries. He took one long look at my face, at the grim, hardened set of my jaw, and the absolute dead silence in my posture. He immediately took off his reading glasses, placed them carefully on the desk, and gestured toward the heavy leather chair opposite him. He asked me what was wrong. He said I looked like a man who had just watched the world end. I sat down heavily in the leather chair. I did not waste a single second with small talk. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and set it flat on the center of his wooden desk. Then I reached inside my jacket, pulled out the thick, folded manila folder containing the forged quitclaim deed, and placed it right next to the phone. I looked Abraham dead in the eye and told him that my son had just tried to trick me into signing away my life savings while my wife was suffocating on a hospital ventilator. Abraham's thick silver eyebrows furrowed. He leaned forward, intertwining his fingers, resting his chin on his hands. He told me to start from the absolute beginning. I laid out the entire horrific nightmare. I told him about the freezing rain the night before. I told him how my son Kevin and his snobbish wife Jessica had deliberately pushed Sarah out onto the uncovered porch because the sound of her dialysis machine was bothering their wealthy guest. I told him about the $92,000 I had willingly drained from my union retirement account a year ago to save Kevin from what I believed was total financial ruin. And then I tapped the screen of my phone, bringing up the recorded security footage from my living room. I pushed the phone across the desk. I told Abraham to listen very carefully to the man lounging on my sofa with his shoes on my coffee table. I told him it was Jessica's brother Todd, a slick suburban real estate broker. Abraham stared at the screen. The quiet office was suddenly filled with the arrogant, cruel voices of the people I had trusted. Abraham listened to Todd laughing about tossing the sick old bat out into the cold. He listened to my own son chuckling in agreement, complaining about property values. He listened as Todd bragged about fabricating the fake bankruptcy, using a dummy corporation in Delaware to siphon my retirement funds directly into his own pockets. He watched as they meticulously planned to trick me at the hospital with the forged quitclaim deed, plotting to sell the house I bought and abandon Sarah and me to a state-run hospice. I watched Abraham's face as the video played. The seasoned, hardened lawyer who had seen decades of corruption, greed, and human ugliness grew incredibly still. The muscles in his jaw tightened so intensely, I could see the pulse beating at his temple. When the video finally ended, showing them toasting their champagne glasses to my impending destruction, Abraham did not say a word for a long, agonizing minute. He simply reached out and picked up the manila folder. He opened it and pulled out the forged documents Kevin had tried to force upon me just an hour earlier. He slid his reading glasses back onto his face and scrutinized the papers with a cold, clinical precision. He examined the fake hospital liability waivers designed to mask the municipal property transfer forms. He traced the expertly replicated notary stamps and the dense legal jargon Todd had used to create the ultimate real estate snare. Abraham slowly lowered the papers to the desk. He looked at me and his voice was dangerously quiet, a simmering, barely contained fury. He told me he had prosecuted slum lords, embezzlers, and corporate thieves who would balk at this level of depravity. He said what they had orchestrated was not just a profound moral failure, but a highly sophisticated, coordinated criminal conspiracy. He turned toward his dual computer monitors. His fingers began to fly across the mechanical keyboard with a sudden, aggressive intensity. He told me we needed to trace the exact architecture of their fraud. I sat in silence listening to the rapid-fire clicking of the keys as Abraham navigated through deeply guarded municipal databases, public property records, and corporate registry networks. He asked me for the exact date I authorized the $92,000 wire transfer from my bank. I gave him the date and the specific routing numbers Kevin had provided me a year ago. Abraham typed the information into a specialized financial tracking terminal. The glow of the monitors reflected off his silver glasses. 10 minutes later, Abraham stopped typing. He leaned back in his heavy chair and turned one of the monitors directly toward me. He pointed to a complex web of digital records displayed on the screen. He told me that the routing number Kevin gave me did not belong to a legitimate mortgage lender or a verified collection agency. It was tied directly to a limited liability company registered in Wilmington, Delaware. The company was named Horizon Holdings. Abraham pulled up the incorporation documents. The registered managing agent for Horizon Holdings was not a bank. It was Todd. Abraham explained the sheer malicious brilliance of their scam. Todd had used his professional real estate credentials to manufacture incredibly authentic-looking foreclosure threats and bankruptcy filings. They completely fabricated a financial crisis, knowing my deep-seated need to protect my son would blind me to the administrative details. Once I wired the money to Horizon Holdings, Todd simply absorbed my entire life savings into his own offshore business accounts. They had stolen my future to fund their luxurious lifestyle. But then Abraham smiled. It was a cold, sharp, predatory smile that sent a shiver of anticipation straight down my spine. He tapped his finger against the original physical property deed I had brought with me from my personal files. He told me that Todd and Kevin made one catastrophic, arrogant miscalculation. Because I had insisted on being the primary signature on the official home purchase a year ago, refusing to just hand them raw cash without securing the asset, the house was absolutely legally mine. Todd could not sell the property without my legally verified signature on that quitclaim deed. That was why Kevin was so utterly desperate to trick me at the hospital this morning. They needed my signature to liquidate the stolen asset. I leaned forward, gripping the wooden edge of the desk. I asked Abraham what my immediate options were. I asked him how long it would take to drag them through the court system to get them out of my house so I could bring my wife home to a safe environment. Abraham took off his glasses and locked his piercing eyes onto mine. He told me I did not need to wait for a judge. He told me I did not need to file a lengthy civil lawsuit or wait months for a bureaucratic eviction process to wind its way through a backlogged court system. He explained the absolute unyielding power of my legal position. Because there was no formal written lease agreement between me and Kevin, they were legally classified as at-will tenants. Furthermore, because Kevin had drastically violated the verbal financial agreement to repay the mortgage and was actively engaged in documented felony fraud against the property owner, their residency status was immediately null and void. Abraham stated with absolute legal certainty that they were no longer considered tenants under state law. Because of their documented criminal conspiracy to steal the property, they were now legally classified as hostile trespassers. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and profound. I possessed the absolute legal authority to reclaim my castle. I did not need permission. I did not need to beg. Abraham leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. He told me I had every right to secure my property immediately. He said I could change the locks, shut down the security grid, and throw their belongings out onto the lawn the very second they vacated the premises. He warned me that it would be a brutal, messy confrontation when they realized they had been locked out, but the law would stand entirely on my side. He promised to personally draft the immediate cease and desist orders and the formal criminal trespassing notices. I sat back in the leather chair, processing the monumental shift in my reality. For months, I had walked around that massive house, tiptoeing quietly, trying not to disturb my wealthy son and his refined wife. I had allowed them to dictate where Sarah could sit, what she could watch on television, and when she could use her medical equipment. I had shrunk myself down, stripping away my own dignity just to keep the peace. I had let them treat me like a foolish, tolerated guest in the very sanctuary my own blood and sweat had purchased. That pathetic, accommodating version of Roland evaporated entirely. A deep, powerful fire ignited in my chest, spreading through my veins like molten iron. I looked at the forged quitclaim deed resting on the desk. I looked at the financial records exposing their greed. I felt the agonizing memory of my wife shivering in the freezing rain push me past the point of sorrow and directly into the realm of absolute righteous retribution. I told Abraham to draft the papers. I told him I wanted the legal notices printed on the thickest, heaviest paper he had in his office. I wanted the municipal seals stamped loud and clear. I looked my old friend in the eye and told him that by the time the sun set this weekend, my house would be completely purged of their poison. Abraham nodded slowly, a look of profound respect settling onto his weathered face. He reached for his phone to call his private network of trusted locksmiths and security technicians. The consultation was over. The strategy was locked in. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, feeling taller and stronger than I had in a decade. I walked out of the law office, the forged documents secure in my pocket, stepping back out into the cold Chicago afternoon. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow to fall. I was the architect of their impending absolute destruction, and I was ready to go to war. The torrential rain had finally stopped, leaving the Chicago streets slick and shining under the heavy, bruised gray sky. I sat in the cab of my old pickup truck, in the far corner of the hospital parking garage, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine. The heater blasted warm air against my damp jeans, but the chill I felt was buried deep in my bones. I had just left Abraham Sterling's office with a mind sharper than a freshly honed razor. I had a rock-solid legal strategy and the full weight of the law firmly on my side. But an airtight legal strategy was only half the battle. Abraham had warned me that trying to legally evict hostile squatters while they were physically entrenched inside the property could easily devolve into a dangerous, chaotic circus. Kevin and his slick brother-in-law Todd would undoubtedly call the police. They would scream, shout, and wave their fake documents around, trying to muddy the waters and delay the authorities. I could not risk a messy public standoff that might end with me answering questions in a precinct while they remained comfortably sleeping under my roof. I needed a clean strike. I needed absolute total control of the battlefield. And to achieve that control, I needed them out of the house. I needed the property completely empty so Abraham's security team could sweep in, change every single lock, drop the steel bolts, and activate a fortress they could never breach. I stared through the rain-streaked windshield, formulating the perfect lie. I had to exploit the single greatest weakness my son possessed, his unadulterated, blinding greed. Kevin and Jessica genuinely believed they were the smartest people in any room. They believed I was a broken, exhausted, obsolete old man who had simply given up the fight. I needed to feed that exact delusion. I needed to hand them a victory so sweet and so perfectly wrapped that they would completely drop their guard. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. My thick thumb hovered over Kevin's name in my contact list. A profound, sickening wave of nausea washed over me. The very thought of hearing his voice, the voice of the man who had casually plotted to leave my beautiful Sarah to rot in an underfunded state facility, made my blood physically boil. I had to close my eyes and pray for strength. I asked the Lord to grant me the patience of Job and the quiet, deadly cunning of a serpent. I took a deep, heavy breath consciously, forcing my rigid shoulders to slump forward. I cleared my throat deliberately, letting the raw, raspy fatigue of the past 36 sleepless hours bleed into my vocal cords. I had to sound like a man who had absolutely nothing left to give. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. It rang twice before Kevin answered. His voice came through the speaker smooth and dripping with that terrible artificial concern he had perfected. He asked me how I was holding up. He asked if there was any positive news about Mom. He played the role of the worried, devoted son with such effortless grace that it genuinely terrified me. I squeezed my eyes shut and leaned my head back against the cold glass of the truck window. I let out a long, trembling sigh, ensuring the microphone caught every ounce of my manufactured defeat. I told him I was just so incredibly tired. I let my voice crack perfectly, mimicking the sound of a father whose spirit had finally been crushed under the weight of an impossible burden. I told him the doctors were saying Sarah's condition was not improving the way we had hoped. I said she needed long-term comprehensive rehabilitation, and the hospital was demanding to discharge her to a secondary care facility by the end of the week. I paused, letting the heavy, pathetic silence hang on the line. I could almost hear the greedy gears turning in his head. Then I delivered the masterstroke. I told Kevin that I had been doing a lot of hard thinking. I said I realized I was just too old and too worn out to take care of her properly at home. I told him I did not want to be a heavy burden on him and Jessica anymore. I spun a beautiful, tragic lie. I explained that I had found a quiet, rural rehabilitation center out in the countryside about 3 hours away from the city. I told him it was a modest, state-subsidized facility, but it was the best I could manage on my fixed income. I said I was going to drive out there this weekend to arrange the admission paperwork and prepare a small room for myself at a cheap motel nearby so I could stay close to her. Kevin did not interrupt me. He was listening to his ultimate dream falling perfectly into place. I was voluntarily removing the sick old bat from his pristine living room. I was taking myself entirely out of the equation. I was handing him the empty house on a silver platter. I swallowed hard, forcing the bitter bile down my throat, and continued the performance. I brought up the manila folder he had pushed onto my lap that morning. I told him I was deeply sorry for being so confused and stubborn earlier. I said my head was just spinning with all the medical jargon and the absolute terror of losing his mother. I told him I knew he was only trying to help manage the overwhelming financial stress. I promised him, using the most fragile, compliant tone I could muster, that I would bring my reading glasses to the hospital first thing Monday morning. I swore to him I would sign every single page of those insurance documents so he would not have to worry about a thing. The shift in his voice was instantaneous. The fake sorrow vanished entirely, replaced by an eager, buzzing excitement he could barely contain. He told me that was a great idea. He said moving Mom to a countryside facility was probably the most responsible and loving choice I could make. He praised my maturity. He praised my willingness to let go of the burden. The sheer absolute monstrosity of his words nearly made me crush the phone in my bare hand. He was actively encouraging me to abandon my wife to a low-income rural clinic so he could sell my home and buy a luxury beach condo. He quickly reassured me about the paperwork. He told me not to stress about the signatures over the weekend. He said Monday morning was perfectly fine and that he would personally come down to the hospital to help me finalize the paperwork so we could put all this ugly financial business behind us. He told me he loved me. He actually had the absolute demonic nerve to say those sacred words to me. I forced out a quiet, broken goodbye and ended the call. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel with both hands. I squeezed the thick leather until my scarred joints ached, my chest heaving with heavy, aggressive breaths. I had done it. I had humbled my pride and played the pathetic, broken fool to absolute perfection. The bait was in the water, and the predator had swallowed it whole. I sat in the truck for another 20 minutes, waiting for the furious adrenaline to subside. Then I picked up my phone and opened the smart home security application. I tapped on the primary living room camera feed. I needed to see the immediate aftermath of my performance. I needed to know if they were actually taking the bait. The high-definition video loaded onto my screen. The scene unfolding in my living room was a portrait of pure, unadulterated triumph. Kevin was standing in the center of the room, his phone still clutched in his hand. He was grinning so widely, his face looked physically stretched. Jessica and Todd were sitting on the expensive leather sofa, watching him with eager, anticipating eyes. I turned up the volume on my phone. Kevin let out a loud, victorious shout that rattled the small speaker. He looked at his wife and her brother, Famu, and announced that the old fool had completely kufsoned. He laughed, a deep, booming laugh that made my stomach physically turn. He repeated my entire fabricated story to them, mocking my tired, cracking voice. He told them I was voluntarily packing up and moving to some depressing state facility in the middle of nowhere to play nursemaid. He told them I had practically apologized for not signing the quitclaim deed earlier and promised to deliver my absolute surrender on Monday morning. Todd jumped up from the sofa and clapped Kevin heavily on the shoulder. He praised his incredible negotiating skills. Todd declared that the property was officially secured. He said the Monday morning signature was just a minor administrative delay, but the hard part was entirely over. They had won. The house was theirs. The millions of dollars were practically sitting in their bank accounts. Jessica squealed with delight. She wrapped her arms around Kevin's neck and kissed him. She stepped back and looked around my beautiful home, her eyes shining with pure greed. She told Kevin they could not just sit around this depressing suburban house all weekend. She said they needed to celebrate properly. She reminded him about the luxury oceanfront resort they had been looking at down in Florida. She said they should book a spontaneous celebratory weekend getaway right now. She argued that since the old man was going to be out in the country dealing with the sick mother, and the house was going to be completely empty, there was absolutely no reason for them to stick around the gloomy city. Todd enthusiastically agreed. He said a weekend on the beach drinking vintage champagne was exactly what they deserved after executing such a stressful and brilliant financial maneuver. He pulled out his phone and immediately started looking up first-class flight tickets and premium resort suites. Kevin smiled, wrapping his arm around his wife's waist. He told Todd to book the most expensive penthouse suite available. He bragged that by this time next week, they would have more cash than they could ever spend. He said they would leave tonight, fly down to the coast, enjoy the sun and the sand, and fly back late Sunday evening, just in time to collect my signature on Monday morning. I sat in my truck watching the tiny glowing screen, entirely mesmerized by the sheer perfection of their arrogance. It was incredibly poetic. Their own blinding greed was doing my job for me. They were so incredibly eager to spend my stolen money that they were actively packing their bags and vacating the premises. They were abandoning their defensive position, leaving the fortress completely undefended simply because they believed they had already conquered the king. I watched the live feed for the next 2 hours. The camera captured a flurry of excited, chaotic activity. Jessica dragged heavy designer suitcases down the grand, sweeping staircase. Kevin casually poured himself another generous glass of my top-shelf bourbon, while tossing expensive silk shirts and linen trousers into his leather travel bag. They moved through my home with the absolute entitled confidence of royalty. They laughed and joked, making cruel, flippant remarks about how depressing my taste in furniture was, and how glad they were to finally be rid of this boring suburban lifestyle. Every single cruel word they spoke, every dismissive gesture they made only hardened the freezing iron resolve in my veins. They were completely stripping themselves of any lingering shred of humanity. They were making the impending destruction so incredibly easy to execute. I did not feel a single drop of paternal regret. The boy I had loved, the son I had worked my fingers to the bone to provide for, had died a long time ago. The man laughing on my screen was a parasite, and parasites needed to be permanently eradicated. Right around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the security camera showed them congregating in the grand foyer. Todd was holding the front door open, checking his luxury watch. Kevin and Jessica were bundled up in their expensive designer coats, pulling their heavy rolling suitcases toward the threshold. Kevin paused for a brief moment, looking back into the spacious living room. He smiled a smug, self-satisfied grin. He reached out and flipped the heavy brass light switch, plunging the room into shadows. He pulled the heavy front door shut behind him, and the distinctive sharp click of the deadbolt echoed through the camera's audio feed. They were gone. The house was completely empty. I sat in the quiet parking garage, staring at the dark screen of my phone. A profound, heavy silence settled over me. It was the deep calm that arrives right before the storm breaks. I had played the ultimate fool. I had humbled myself, stripped away my pride, and fed their monstrous egos exactly what they craved. And it had worked flawlessly. The trap was not just delayed. The trap had been entirely reversed. I picked up my phone and dialed Abraham Sterling's private direct number. He answered on the very first ring, his gravelly voice sharp and alert. I did not bother with pleasantries. I spoke with a calm, deadly precision. I told the old union lawyer that the targets had officially left the building. I told him they were flying out of state for the weekend, and the property was entirely abandoned. Abraham let out a low, appreciative hum. He told me it was time to move. He said his elite security team and the municipal locksmiths were fully prepped and ready to deploy. He instructed me to drive back to the property and meet them at the front gate. I hung up the phone and started the heavy engine of my pickup truck. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the concrete pillars of the hospital garage. I put the truck into gear and drove out into the fading afternoon light. I was driving back to the home I had built, the sanctuary I had paid for, with 4 decades of sweat and sacrifice. I was going to reclaim my territory. I was going to change every single lock-drop, heavy steel barricades across the doors and erase every trace of their existence from my property. Kevin and Jessica had left for a luxurious weekend celebration, completely unaware that they were never stepping foot inside my house ever again. The kingdom was about to be locked down permanently, and the reckoning they had so callously invited was finally about to begin. The sky above the Chicago suburbs began to bleed into deep shades of violet and bruised purple as Friday evening settled over the neighborhood. I sat perfectly still inside the cab of my old pickup truck, parked discreetly 2 blocks down from my own property. The heavy engine was cut off, and the interior was growing cold, but I did not dare turn the heater on and draw any attention to myself. I had my eyes locked onto the street corner, waiting for the exact moment the trap would spring perfectly shut. My hands rested on the worn steering wheel, tracing the familiar grooves I had gripped for over a decade. These hands had guided heavy city buses through ice storms and city gridlock for 40 years. They were calloused and scarred from a lifetime of relentless, grueling labor. Every single drop of sweat I had ever spilled was meant to build a legacy for my family, to ensure my son never had to struggle the way I did. Now I was sitting in the shadows of my own neighborhood, waiting to ambush the very boy I had sacrificed my entire youth to protect. Right around 6 o'clock, the sleek silver nose of Kevin's expensive imported SUV slowly crept out of my driveway. I slouched down instinctively, sinking lower into the faded vinyl seat as the vehicle turned onto the main avenue. Through the tinted glass, I could just barely make out the silhouettes of my son and his wife. They were heading straight to O'Hare International Airport. They were flying down to a luxury beach resort in Florida to drink expensive champagne and celebrate their brilliant plan to steal my home and abandon my dying wife. They thought I was currently driving 3 hours away to a depressing rural clinic, completely broken and defeated. They believed they had won the ultimate prize. I watched the red glow of their taillights fade into the evening traffic and disappear completely from view. The heavy, suffocating knot that had been sitting in my chest for 2 days instantly vanished. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. They were gone. The battlefield was entirely empty. I picked up my phone and pressed the speed dial for Abraham Sterling. The old transit union lawyer answered on the first ring with his trademark gravelly voice, asking if the targets were clear. I told him they had just turned onto the highway and the property was totally unsecured. Abraham let out a low rumble of approval and told me to meet him at the front curb in exactly 3 minutes. So I turned the key in the ignition and the truck roared to life. I drove the short distance to my house and parked the truck blocking the driveway. The massive 2-story brick home stood quiet and dark against the twilight sky. It was a beautiful structure. Sarah and I had saved for over 20 years to put down the down payment on this place. We had proudly painted the shutters, planted the azalea bushes in the front yard, and polished the hardwood floors until they shined like glass. And Kevin had turned our sanctuary into a den of thieves. Headlights washed over the front of the house as 3 vehicles pulled up to the curb in rapid succession. Abraham Sterling stepped out of a heavy black sedan, wearing a dark wool overcoat and leaning slightly on a thick wooden cane. Behind him, 2 unmarked white utility vans parked tightly against the curb. 4 men stepped out of the vans wearing heavy canvas work jackets and carrying massive industrial tool bags. They were Abraham's trusted private security team and master locksmiths. They moved with absolute silent precision, The kind of quiet efficiency you only see in men who are used to handling serious, high-stakes situations. Abraham walked up the driveway, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the concrete. He looked at me, his piercing silver eyes catching the fading light. He did not ask if I was ready or if I was having second thoughts. He knew the absolute resolve burning inside my veins. He simply nodded toward the front door and told the crew to breach the perimeter. We walked up the front steps together. The lead locksmith, a massive man with a thick gray beard and forearms like tree trunks, did not even bother asking for my old house keys. He knew Kevin might have installed secondary deadbolts or smart locks I was unaware of. He pulled a heavy commercial-grade drill from his bag and pressed the steel bit directly into the center of the brass lock. The loud, aggressive screech of metal tearing through metal shattered the quiet suburban evening. It was an incredibly harsh, violent sound, but to my ears it was the absolute sweetest symphony. It was the sound of my kingdom being violently reclaimed. It took less than 30 seconds for the heavy brass mechanism to completely shatter. The locksmith pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped aside, allowing me to enter my own home. I walked into the grand foyer and stopped. The air inside the house felt thick and stagnant. A heavy, lingering wave of Jessica's expensive, cloying perfume hung in the air, mixed with the sharp, unmistakable scent of premium bourbon. The massive living room was in a state of chaotic, arrogant disarray. Kevin and Jessica had been in such a rush to pack for their celebratory beach vacation that they had treated the house like a cheap hotel room. Empty crystal glasses were left abandoned on the expensive mahogany coffee table, leaving sticky circular water rings on the polished wood. Discarded clothing boxes and random travel items were thrown carelessly across the Italian leather sofa. They had treated the home my wife and I had built with our own blood and tears like an absolute garbage dump. The sheer visceral disrespect of it made my jaw clench so tightly my teeth physically ached. They truly believed this house was already theirs to destroy. Abraham stepped into the living room behind me, taking in the chaotic mess. He let out a harsh, disgusted scoff. He looked at me and said, "Parasites always leave a trail of filth wherever they go." He was absolutely right. But this infestation was about to be permanently eradicated. Abraham turned to his security team and began barking out orders with the sharp, commanding authority of an army general. He told 2 of the men to start at the front door and work their way around the entire perimeter of the first floor. He ordered them to completely drill out and replace every single entry point: the front door, the heavy sliding glass patio doors in the back, the kitchen side entrance, and the secure door leading into the garage. He told the other 2 men to head straight for the central security hub in the basement to begin the digital purge. The house immediately transformed into a beehive of intense, aggressive activity. The loud, piercing whine of power drills echoed from the kitchen. The heavy, rhythmic thud of hammers knocking out old strike plates vibrated through the floorboards. I stood in the center of the living room watching the men systematically dismantle the false security Kevin had enjoyed. Every time a lock was shattered and pulled from the doorframe, I felt a heavy chain physically snapping off my own shoulders. I walked over to the mahogany coffee table and picked up the empty crystal glass Kevin had been drinking from. I held it in my rough, scarred hands, remembering how he had sat in this exact spot, laughing with Todd about sending Sarah to a state-run facility. I felt an intense, burning urge to smash the glass directly into the stone fireplace. But I restrained myself. I set the glass down gently. I was not going to stoop to their level of chaotic destruction. I was executing a legally sanctioned, surgically precise removal. One of the security technicians, a younger man holding a sleek silver laptop, walked up the stairs from the basement and approached Abraham. He reported that Kevin had indeed installed his own secondary digital security codes on the main alarm panel, but the system was amateur and easily bypassed. Abraham looked at me and told me it was time to take absolute control of the digital grid. I followed the technician into the hallway, where the main smart home terminal was mounted against the wall. The bright touchscreen displayed a series of green icons indicating the house was secure. The technician plugged a specialized data cable directly from his laptop into the bottom of the wall panel. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the generic passwords Kevin had set up. He asked me for a new master passcode. He told me to pick something complex, something they would never be able to guess in a million years. I stood there for a moment, thinking about the absolute foundation of my life. I thought about the year Sarah and I were married. I thought about the badge number I wore on my transit uniform for 4 decades. I rattled off a 12-character alphanumeric code that was permanently burned into my soul. The technician typed it into the system and hit the enter key. The screen flashed a brilliant bright blue, indicating the master override was completely successful. Kevin and Jessica's digital fingerprints were entirely wiped from the system. Their smartphone applications were instantly disconnected. Their remote access privileges were permanently revoked. If they tried to look at the cameras right now while sipping cocktails in Florida, all they would see was a black screen telling them their access was denied. But we were not finished. I pulled my own phone from my pocket and opened the hidden application for the discrete micro cameras I had installed months ago, the very cameras that had exposed their horrific plot in the first place. I synced the hidden cameras directly to the new master security hub. I set the system to record directly to a secure cloud server that only Abraham and I could access. If Kevin ever somehow managed to step foot near this property again, every single word he spoke, every move he made would be captured and preserved as absolute legal evidence. While the technician finalized the digital lockdown, I walked out to the garage. The second locksmith was already packing up his heavy tools. He had completely disconnected the electronic garage door opener, unspooling the receiver wire and resetting the physical locking mechanism. He handed me a pair of heavy brass keys, telling me the entire garage grid was now operating on a closed, encrypted frequency. The remote clicker sitting in Kevin's luxury SUV at the airport parking lot was now completely useless. I walked back into the main house. The transformation was absolutely astonishing. In less than an hour, Abraham's crew had completely fortified the entire structure. Every single exterior door was now fitted with heavy commercial-grade deadbolts that required a specialized key to open. The strike plates were reinforced with solid steel brackets driven deep into the wooden framing. The house was no longer just a suburban home. It was an impenetrable fortress. The lead locksmith approached me, wiping grease from his thick hands with a canvas rag. He held out a heavy steel key ring containing 3 identical brass keys. He told me the perimeter was 100% secure. He guaranteed me that nobody was getting through those doors without a battering ram or my explicit permission. I took the heavy keys, feeling the cold, solid metal pressing into my palm. It was the absolute weight of total ownership. I thanked him, slipping the keys deep into my pocket. Abraham stood by the front door, watching his men pack up their equipment and head back out to the utility vans. He leaned heavily on his wooden cane, his silver eyes scanning the quiet, fortified house. He told me the physical extraction was complete. He said the property was officially secured, and my legal standing as the sole occupant was absolute. Because Kevin had no written lease and was actively engaged in documented felony fraud, his belongings were now considered abandoned property. Abraham reached into his wool overcoat and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. He handed it to me, explaining that it contained the official cease and desist orders, the criminal trespassing warnings, and the comprehensive legal notifications outlining their eviction. He told me that when Kevin and Jessica returned from their little celebratory vacation, they were going to find those documents taped directly to the front door, right next to the new steel deadbolts. I took the envelope, holding it tightly. I looked at the older lawyer, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for his ruthless efficiency. I told Abraham I did not know how to adequately thank him for what he had done tonight. Abraham shook his head, letting out a low, raspy chuckle. He told me I had spent 40 years working the hardest, most thankless job in the city, keeping the wheels turning for people who never gave me a second glance. He said taking down a couple of arrogant, entitled parasites was the absolute least he could do to repay that kind of dedication. He told me to stay strong and keep my guard up because Monday morning was going to be a brutal, ugly collision. I walked Abraham out to his black sedan, shaking his hand firmly, before he drove away into the night. The two white utility vans followed closely behind him, disappearing down the quiet suburban street. I stood completely alone on my front porch. The neighborhood was silent, except for the faint sound of the wind rustling through the old oak trees. The freezing rain from the day before had left a sharp, bitter chill in the air, but I felt incredibly warm. I turned around and looked at the heavy, reinforced front door. I pulled the new brass key from my pocket, slid it into the lock, and turned it. The heavy steel bolt slid into place with a loud, satisfying thud. I walked back into the center of the living room, standing amidst the chaotic mess Kevin and Jessica had left behind. I did not clean up the empty bourbon glasses or move their discarded boxes. I wanted to leave it exactly as it was. I wanted them to remember the arrogant, entitled mess they had made right before the world crashed down upon them. I walked over to the fireplace mantel and picked up a small, silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of Sarah and me taken on our 25th wedding anniversary. She was smiling so brightly, her eyes shining with pure, unconditional love. I brushed my thumb gently across the glass. I promised her right then and there that the monsters who had tried to discard her would never be allowed to hurt her again. I promised her that I would stand like a wall of solid iron between her and the boy who had broken our hearts. The house was completely silent. The trap had been flawlessly sprung. The locks were changed, the codes were wiped, and the legal barricades were firmly in place. I walked over to the large leather armchair, the one Kevin always claimed as his own, and sat down heavily. I did not turn on the television or the radio. I simply sat in the quiet darkness of my reclaimed kingdom, waiting for the inevitable explosive confrontation that Monday morning would bring. I was no longer a victim. I was the master of the house, and the reckoning was fully prepared. I closed my tired eyes, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute readiness. Let them come back from their luxurious beach vacation. Let them try to turn their key in my door. I was exactly where I needed to be, and I was never going to back down again. I stood in the center of the living room, letting the profound silence of the secured house wash over me. Abraham and his security crew had just left. The heavy steel deadbolts were thrown. The new locks were completely engaged. But my work for the night was far from over. I turned my back on the messy, expensive Italian leather sofa and made my way down the long, hardwood hallway toward the back of the property. I was heading directly for my son's private home office. Kevin had always treated that specific room like his own personal royal sanctuary. From the moment he and Jessica moved into my home, he had practically forbidden Sarah and me from ever crossing the threshold. He claimed he needed absolute quiet and highly restricted access to handle his high-level corporate stress. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The pure arrogance of the room was immediately suffocating. A massive imported mahogany desk dominated the center of the space. Expensive abstract paintings hung on the walls in ornate frames. A sleek leather executive chair sat behind the desk, looking like a dark throne built entirely on a foundation of deceit. I walked around the desk, running my rough, scarred fingers along the polished wood edge. My blood pressure simmered just beneath the surface as I looked at the sheer, unearned luxury he surrounded himself with, while his mother had been suffocating on a hospital ventilator. But I was not there to admire his stolen furniture. I was looking for the heart of his operation. I knew my son deeply because despite his current monstrous behavior, I had spent 35 years studying his habits. Kevin was incredibly vain, but he was also fundamentally lazy. He loved the illusion of security without ever putting in the actual mental effort required to maintain it. I scanned the room slowly, letting my eyes track across the dark paneled walls. Behind a framed photograph of Kevin and Jessica standing on a chartered yacht, I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a sleek digital wall safe embedded flush against the drywall. I pulled the picture frame off its hook and set it face down on the desk. The keypad stared back at me, glowing with a faint blue light in the shadows. I did not need to call a professional safecracker to breach this metal box. I knew my boy was far too arrogant to use a complex randomized security code. He would use something he deemed highly important, but easily memorable. I raised my hand and typed in the numbers corresponding to his wedding anniversary. I punched in the exact month, day, and year he stood at the church altar and bound his life to that venomous snake, Jessica. I pressed the pound key. The digital lock let out a soft, cheerful chime, and the heavy steel door clicked wide open. I pulled the safe door back and looked inside. The breath caught hot and sharp in the back of my throat. Stacked neatly on the bottom metal shelf were thick, banded bundles of crisp $100 bills, thousands upon thousands of dollars in stolen cash. This was my transit union retirement fund. This was the exact money I had sacrificed my aching joints and endured freezing Chicago winters to accumulate. They had siphoned it through Todd's fake shell company and converted it into their own personal slush fund, but the cash was merely a fraction of the treasure buried in that dark metal box. Resting right on top of the money was a thick, heavy-duty document binder. I reached in and pulled it out, setting it gently on the mahogany desk under the bright glow of the expensive brass lamp. My calloused hands were completely steady as I opened the binder. Inside lay the absolute holy grail of their entire criminal enterprise. I was staring directly at the original physical copies of the forged documents Todd had manufactured to ruin me. There were the fake collection letters printed on fraudulent bank letterhead. There were the fabricated bankruptcy filings complete with illegally duplicated notary stamps and counterfeit county clerk seals. Every single lie they had spun to trick me out of my $92,000 was meticulously filed and cataloged right here in black and white ink. Todd and Kevin had kept the physical evidence like proud trophies. They were so utterly blinded by their own arrogance that they actually kept the exact blueprint of their felony fraud inside the very house they were actively trying to steal. I felt a cold, fierce smile spread across my face. I carefully gathered the fraudulent documents and the thick stacks of stolen cash and placed them into a heavy leather duffel bag I found sitting in the corner of the office. I zipped the bag shut, feeling the highly satisfying heavy weight of absolute, undeniable justice resting directly in my grip. I had the video recordings. I had the audio confessions, and now I possessed the smoking gun of their financial treason. They were completely and permanently checkmated. But revenge was only the secondary mission of the evening. The primary mission, the only thing that truly mattered to my soul, was securing the safety and dignity of the beautiful woman I loved. I picked up my phone and dialed the private medical transport company Abraham had recommended earlier. Because the house was now legally purged of the hostile trespassers, and because I had absolute physical control of the property, I could finally bring my queen back to her castle. The hospital administrators had tried to argue earlier in the day, but with Abraham's aggressive legal threats clearing the path, they had absolutely no choice but to authorize Sarah's immediate transfer to a private home care setup. About 2 hours later, the flashing yellow lights of a private medical transport ambulance illuminated the wet pavement of my driveway. I unlocked the heavy reinforced front doors and stood on the porch, watching the paramedics carefully guide Sarah's rolling stretcher down the metal ramp. She looked so small and fragile, wrapped in thick white hospital blankets. But the very moment she crossed the threshold of our home, a tiny, faint flicker of warmth seemed to return to her pale cheeks. We bypassed the downstairs living area entirely. I directed the medical team straight up the grand sweeping staircase and into the massive master bedroom that Kevin and Jessica had selfishly claimed for themselves. Yesterday, this room was a monument to their spoiled entitlement. Tonight, it was completely transformed into a state-of-the-art, comfortable medical sanctuary. Earlier that afternoon, using the recovered cash from the safe, I had hired a premium medical supply service to deliver everything Sarah could possibly need to heal. A top-tier adjustable hospital bed was positioned right near the large bay windows so she could look out at the old oak trees when the sun came up. Brand new silent oxygen concentrators and top-of-the-line dialysis monitors hummed quietly in the corner, completely replacing the harsh, aggressive mechanical noises of the public intensive care unit. The transport nurses gently transferred my beautiful wife into the fresh, comfortable linens. I stood in the corner of the large room, watching her chest rise and fall with a steady, peaceful rhythm. The frantic rattling in her lungs had finally smoothed out. She was safe. She was home. She was completely surrounded by love and absolute security. Once the nurses finished setting up the intravenous lines and the overnight monitoring equipment, they quietly packed their bags and went downstairs. I had hired a private round-the-clock registered nurse to stay in the guest bedroom down the hall, ensuring Sarah had constant professional care every single minute of the day. I pulled a plush, comfortable armchair right up to the side of her bed and sat down. I gently took her fragile hand in my massive, rough palms. Her skin was warm. I brought her knuckles to my lips and closed my eyes, letting the tears I had been holding back for days finally fall down my face. They were not tears of pain or defeat. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. I whispered to her in the quiet, dimly lit room. I promised her that the terrible storm was officially over. I promised her that the people who hurt her and discarded her like trash would never step foot near her ever again. I told her to just rest and focus entirely on healing her body because her husband had taken the wheel and the road ahead was perfectly clear. Around midnight, after Sarah had fallen into a deep, restful sleep, I walked back downstairs. The house was wrapped in a thick, protective silence. I carried the heavy legal envelope Abraham had given me and walked out to the grand front entrance. The freezing rain had finally stopped, leaving the night air crisp and sharp. I stood on the front porch under the glow of the amber security lights, holding the thick, legally binding eviction and cease and desist notices. I pulled a roll of heavy industrial duct tape from my pocket. I did not use a single piece of delicate, clear tape. I slapped the thick municipal documents directly onto the center of the heavy oak doors, using long, aggressive strips of silver tape. I plastered the bold red and black no trespassing warnings right at eye level, where Kevin and Jessica could not possibly miss them. I smoothed my hand over the rough tape, making sure the notices were practically cemented to the wood. I stepped back and admired the view. The documents practically screamed with undeniable legal authority. Anyone walking up to this porch would instantly know that the people who used to live here had been officially and permanently banished. I walked back inside the house and shut the heavy door behind me. I reached out and turned the new commercial-grade steel deadbolts, listening to the heavy metallic thud echoing loudly through the foyer. I engaged the new alarm system, typing in the secure master code that only I knew. The control panel glowed a steady, reassuring green. The garage codes were wiped. The smart locks were drilled and replaced. The cameras were recalibrated, recording every single angle of the perimeter directly to a secure remote server. The fortress was completely and officially sealed. I walked back up the stairs and checked on Sarah one last time before settling into the chair beside her bed. I felt a deep, powerful sense of righteous satisfaction warming my tired bones. Kevin, Jessica, and Todd were currently sleeping in a luxury beachfront hotel thousands of miles away, dreaming about the millions of dollars they thought they were going to steal from me on Monday morning. They were sipping champagne and laughing at my perceived stupidity. They had absolutely no idea that they were currently homeless. They had no idea that their criminal enterprise was sitting in a duffel bag at my feet. They had no idea that the pathetic old man they had callously discarded was sitting in his fortified castle holding a legal guillotine directly over their arrogant necks. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the long-awaited reckoning was only a weekend away. The storm rolled back into Chicago late Sunday evening, as if the universe itself was demanding a perfect poetic symmetry. Thick, heavy drops began to drum against the reinforced glass of the newly secured windows. It was the exact same bitter, freezing downpour that had masked my wife's suffering just days prior. I stood in the darkened hallway of the second floor, looking out through the rain-streaked panes. The wind howled through the old oak trees, bending the branches in a violent dance. But tonight, the storm outside could not touch us. Upstairs in the master suite, Sarah was sleeping deeply. The state-of-the-art medical equipment hummed with a quiet, steady rhythm, filling the room with a sense of absolute, profound peace. The private nurse I had hired was sitting dutifully by her side, reading a book under a soft amber lamp. My queen was finally safe, wrapped in warmth, and surrounded by an impenetrable fortress. Downstairs, the house was completely silent. The heavy commercial-grade deadbolts I had installed on Friday night were locked tight into the steel-reinforced door frames. The digital security grid was fully operational, blinking, with a quiet green light, indicating that the perimeter was completely sealed. I walked slowly down the grand, sweeping staircase, my footsteps making absolutely no sound on the thick plush carpet. I was not wearing my old, faded transit uniform or my comfortable, worn-out denim jeans. Tonight required a completely different kind of armor. I was dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white cotton shirt, and a dark burgundy tie. My leather dress shoes were polished to a mirror shine. I dressed like a man preparing to walk into a federal courtroom. I dressed like a patriarch stepping up to defend the absolute sanctity of his home. In my right hand I carried the thick, heavy black leather binder. It was the exact binder I had taken from Kevin's wall safe. It held the original physical copies of the forged quitclaim deed, the fake bankruptcy filings, the Delaware Shell Company registries, and the documented proof of the $92,000 they had stolen from my retirement fund. The leather felt cool and solid against my palm. It was the physical manifestation of their absolute ruin. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. Sitting at the large granite island were two uniformed officers from the local precinct. Officer Miller and Officer Davis were veteran cops, men who had patrolled this district for years. I had contacted them earlier in the evening, laying out the entire situation exactly as Abraham Sterling had advised. I had shown them the official municipal property deed, proving I was the sole legal owner of the estate. I had shown them the certified eviction notices and the criminal trespassing warnings that were legally filed on Friday afternoon. They had drank my coffee, listened to my story, and understood exactly what was about to happen. They were good, decent men who respected the gray hair on my head and the 40 years of sweat equity I had poured into this city. They sat quietly sipping their coffee, waiting for the signal. Right around 9 o'clock, my smartphone vibrated softly in the breast pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled it out and tapped the screen. The encrypted high-definition security application loaded instantly. Through the camera mounted above the garage, I watched a pair of bright white headlights slice through the driving rain. The sleek silver nose of Kevin's expensive luxury sport utility vehicle pulled smoothly into the driveway. The traders had finally returned from their celebratory beach vacation. I watched the live video feed with an icy, detached calm. The luxury vehicle sat idling in the downpour, its windshield wipers slapping back and forth with a frantic, sweeping motion. I could see the faint glow of the dashboard lights illuminating Kevin's face. He was deeply tanned from the Florida sun, looking relaxed and utterly triumphant. He leaned over the center console, his manicured hand pointing a sleek plastic remote toward the garage door. He pressed the button, expecting the heavy wooden panels to glide open and welcome him into the castle he thought he had stolen. Nothing happened. The garage door remained completely motionless, unyielding against the storm. I watched the immediate flash of confusion cross my son's face. He pressed the button again, hitting it harder this time, as if sheer physical force could compel the digital receiver to respond. He had absolutely no idea that the locksmiths had completely severed the electronic wiring and wiped the receiver codes 2 days ago. The expensive remote clicker in his hand was now nothing more than a useless piece of decorative plastic. Jessica leaned forward from the passenger seat, her face twisting into a sharp, ugly scowl of irritation. The security microphone picked up the muffled sound of her complaining. She was whining about the cold rain, complaining that the automatic system was malfunctioning, and demanding that Kevin fix it immediately so her expensive resort clothes would not get wet. Frustrated and completely oblivious to the reality of his situation, Kevin finally killed the engine and pushed his door open. He stepped out into the freezing downpour, lifting a large designer leather travel bag over his shoulder. Jessica followed closely behind him, her expensive high-heeled shoes splashing carelessly into the deep, muddy puddles of the driveway. She frantically tried to shield her freshly styled hair with a silk scarf, cursing the Chicago weather. They trudged up the front walkway, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind, pulling their heavy rolling suitcases behind them. They looked exactly like a couple of wealthy, entitled vacationers who were merely inconvenienced by a minor technical glitch. They were completely unaware that they were currently walking onto a heavily fortified battlefield. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked slowly toward the grand foyer. Officer Miller and Officer Davis stood up from the kitchen island, adjusting their heavy utility belts, and followed me down the hall. We stood in the dark shadows of the entryway, completely silent, waiting for the final act of their arrogant play to unfold. Through the heavy oak door, I could hear their footsteps landing heavily on the covered porch. I heard the wet squelch of their designer shoes and the aggressive rattling of the suitcase wheels. Kevin let out a sharp, annoyed sigh as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his gold-plated ring of house keys. I listened closely as he selected the primary key, slid it into the keyway, and twisted his wrist. The key stopped dead. It did not even slide halfway into the cylinder. I could hear the sudden metallic scraping as Kevin tried to force the key into the new commercial-grade lock. He pulled it out, looked at it, and shoved it back in, pushing his shoulder against the solid wood door as if he could simply muscle his way inside. The lock remained completely immovable, an absolute wall of steel. Jessica raised her voice, her sharp, shrill tone cutting right through the sound of the downpour. She demanded to know what was taking so long. She yelled that she was freezing and told Kevin to stop messing around with the keys. Kevin growled back, his voice thick with rising panic and sudden confusion. He told her the lock was completely different. He told her the key would not even fit into the slot anymore. The initial annoyance on the porch rapidly morphed into a volatile mixture of intense frustration and bubbling anger. They truly believed they owned this house. They believed my home was their rightful property. When the keys failed completely, Kevin lost his temper. He raised his large fist and began to pound violently against the heavy oak wood. The loud booming thuds echoed through the quiet foyer where I stood waiting. He shouted my name at the top of his lungs. He yelled for the old man, demanding that I open the door because the lock was jammed. Jessica joined the chorus, pounding her own hands against the wood, screaming that they were freezing and that I needed to stop playing games and let them inside immediately. I looked back at the two police officers. Officer Miller gave me a single firm nod. It was time. I reached out my hand and grasped the heavy brass deadbolt. I turned it slowly, deliberately, making sure the loud metallic sliding sound resonated clearly through the thick wood. The pounding on the other side instantly stopped. I grabbed the handle, pulled the heavy oak door open, and stepped firmly out onto the covered porch. The biting wind whipped across my face, carrying the sharp smell of rain and wet asphalt. I stood directly in the threshold, my broad shoulders completely blocking the entrance. I did not step aside to let them in. I planted my polished leather shoes firmly on the welcome mat, establishing an absolute physical barrier. Officer Miller stepped out immediately to my right, his hand resting casually near his radio. Officer Davis stepped out to my left, shining a bright, heavy-duty, tactical flashlight directly onto the porch. The blinding white beam washed over Kevin and Jessica, instantly exposing the profound shock frozen on their faces. The smug, triumphant post-vacation glow evaporated from my son's face in a single, terrifying second. His jaw dropped slightly, his eyes darting frantically from the sharp lines of my tailored suit to the heavy leather binder in my hand, and finally to the two uniformed police officers flanking me like solid walls of blue authority. Jessica let out a sharp, startled gasp, clutching her designer travel bag tightly against her chest. She took a clumsy step backward, her expensive heel slipping slightly on the wet concrete. She looked at me with an expression of pure, bewildered horror, unable to comprehend why the pathetic, broken old man she had left behind on Friday was currently standing before her, looking like an impenetrable mountain of execution. Kevin tried to recover his posture. He swallowed hard, forcing his chest out, attempting to project the arrogant authority he had practiced for years. He tried to step forward toward the threshold, but I did not yield a single inch. He stopped awkwardly, his shoes squishing in the rainwater. He asked me what was going on. He tried to force a nervous fake laugh, asking why the police were standing on our porch. He reached his hand out, as if to brush past me, telling me it was freezing outside, and that we needed to take this conversation into the living room. I raised my right hand, holding the thick black leather binder horizontally across my chest, effectively blocking his arm. My voice rolled out from the very bottom of my chest, deep calm, and entirely devoid of any parental warmth. I told him he was not crossing this threshold. I told him he was never stepping foot inside this house ever again. The words struck him like a physical blow to the stomach. His sun-tanned face turned a sickly, mottled shade of gray. He stammered, trying to find the smooth corporate lies that usually saved him. He called me Dad, trying to weaponize that sacred title one last time. He asked me what I was talking about, reminding me that this was his home and that his belongings were inside. He looked at Officer Miller and tried to put on a mask of bewildered innocence, claiming that there had been a terrible misunderstanding and that his elderly father was just confused because of the stress of my wife's illness. Officer Miller did not even blink. He stared at Kevin with the cold, hard eyes of a man who had zero tolerance for predators. He informed my son that there was no misunderstanding. The officer stated clearly and loudly over the sound of the rain that according to the official municipal property records, I was the sole verified owner of the estate. Jessica pushed her way forward, her face twisting into an ugly mask of venomous entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, screaming that I was insane. She yelled that they had an agreement. She shouted at the police officers that I was a senile old fool who was having a mental breakdown, and that they had every legal right to walk into their own house. I slowly opened the heavy leather binder, letting the plastic protective sleeves crinkle sharply in the cold wind. I did not look at Jessica. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my son. I pulled out the certified copies of the Delaware Shell Company registries. I pulled out the forged foreclosure warnings. I pulled out the fraudulent bank transfer statements Todd had used to drain my $92,000 retirement fund. I held the stack of papers up right under the bright beam of the police flashlight, ensuring Kevin could see every single line of his exposed treachery. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying, absolute clarity. I told him there was never any bankruptcy. I told him I knew exactly what Horizon Holdings was. I told him I knew that he and his wife had sat in my living room, looked me dead in the eyes, squeezed out fake tears, and robbed my life savings just to buy a luxury beachfront condo. I told him I had the audio recordings of him laughing with Todd about dropping his own mother into a state-run hospice. Kevin's entire body went completely rigid. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified hollow shell. He stared at the forged documents in my hand, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable physical proof of his monstrous felony fraud was staring him right in the face. Jessica let out a hysterical, panicked shriek. She realized instantly that the entire foundation of their stolen, wealthy lifestyle had just collapsed into dust. She turned to Kevin, grabbing his arm violently, demanding that he do something, demanding that he fix this immediately. But Kevin was completely paralyzed. The arrogant predator had finally been caught in the snare. Officer Davis stepped forward, pulling a thick stack of folded papers from his uniform pocket. He handed them directly to Kevin. He stated in a firm, booming voice that those were official criminal trespassing warnings and legally binding cease and desist orders filed by my attorney. The officer told my son that his residency status was immediately null and void due to documented felony fraud against the property owner. Officer Miller stepped right to the very edge of the porch, pointing a thick finger toward the driveway. He told Kevin and Jessica they had exactly 2 minutes to turn around, get back into their vehicle, and drive away from this property. He made it absolutely clear that if they attempted to take one more step toward the doorway, or if they refused to leave the premises immediately, they would be placed in handcuffs, read their rights, and transported directly to the county jail for first-degree criminal trespassing. Kevin stood in the freezing rain, the heavy legal documents trembling violently in his hands. He looked up at me, his eyes welling with real desperate tears. He whispered my name, begging me to please listen to him, begging me not to do this to them. In the middle of a storm, I looked down at the boy. I had loved the boy, I had bled for the boy who had tried to discard the mother who gave him life. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, protective iron wall around my heart. I told him that the house was secured. I told him his mother was safe upstairs, away from his poison. I looked at both of them standing in the mud and told them that their fraudulent high society game was permanently over. I took one step backward, pulling my broad shoulders inside the warmth of my foyer. I did not wait for his response. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled the thick oak door completely shut. The final loud metallic thud of the steel deadbolt sliding perfectly into place echoed like a gunshot, ending their reign of terror forever. The freezing rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, bounding off the concrete steps of the porch and soaking right through the bottom of my trousers. The icy wind howled through the neighborhood, carrying the bitter sting of a brutal Chicago storm. It was the exact same kind of night, the exact same miserable weather that had surrounded my beautiful Sarah when these monsters pushed her out the door. I stood firm in the warm golden light, spilling out from my foyer, completely blocking the entrance to my home. I looked down at the two people who had spent the last year treating me like an obsolete piece of garbage. Jessica was the first to break the heavy tension. When the reality of the locked door and the two uniformed police officers finally registered in her mind, her initial shock instantly morphed into a frantic, unadulterated rage. She threw her hands violently into the air, her expensive leather handbag slipping down her arm. Her carefully styled hair was completely plastered to her face by the driving rain, and her designer coat was entirely soaked. She looked like a cornered animal stripped of her unearned luxury and exposed to the harsh elements. She pointed a shaking diamond-ringed finger directly at my face and let out a high, piercing scream that cut straight through the sound of the storm. She shouted that I was a crazy, washed-up old fool who had completely lost his mind. She screamed that I had no legal right to change the locks on my own house and that I was committing a massive crime. Her voice grew more and more hysterical as she turned toward the two silent police officers, demanding that they arrest me immediately for burglary and elder dementia. When the officers did not move a single muscle, her fury escalated to a fever pitch. She pulled her expensive smartphone from her coat pocket, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. She looked at me with an ugly, venomous scowl and threatened to destroy my entire existence. She screamed that she was calling her brother Todd right this second. She swore that Todd was going to drive over here, drag me out of the house by my collar, and slap me with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that would leave me begging for scraps on the street. She boasted that her family had too much money and too many high-society connections for a retired city bus dispatcher to ever stand a chance against them. I stood perfectly still, letting her shrill, desperate threats wash over me like the cold rain. The grieving, heartbroken father, who used to swallow his pride just to keep the peace at the Sunday dinner table, was permanently gone. I felt absolutely no fear, no hesitation, and no remaining desire to make excuses for this wicked woman. I looked at her with dead, icy eyes, holding her frantic gaze until her screaming began to falter under the weight of my absolute silence. I slowly adjusted my grip on the thick, black leather binder in my left hand. I spoke in a low, calm, measured voice that carried the absolute cold authority of a judge delivering a life sentence. I told her to call him. I told her to dial her brother's number right now and put him on speakerphone. I looked her dead in the eye and told her to tell Todd to bring a very good federal defense attorney with him, because the Federal Bureau of Investigation already had his anonymous shell company's bank records. The color drained from Jessica's face in a single terrifying second. Her mouth hung open, but the arrogant words completely died in her throat. To emphasize the absolute finality of their destruction, I opened the heavy leather binder with a sharp, crisp motion. I pulled out a thick, duplicated stack of the fraudulent foreclosure notices, the fabricated court orders, and the secret bank statements, showing how Todd had siphoned $92,000 of my hard-earned retirement savings into his personal accounts. I tossed the thick bundle of papers straight out onto the wet concrete of the porch, right at their feet. The heavy white sheets scattered across the damp floor, soaking up the rainwater, turning dark and heavy under the amber porch light. The forged signatures, the fake notary stamps, and the Delaware corporate registries were completely exposed to the night air. I told them to look very closely at the paperwork, because those exact documents were currently sitting on a desk at the federal prosecutor's office. Before Jessica could even process the devastating reality of my words, the sudden aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet of the suburban street. A sleek, bright red sports car came tearing around the corner, its wide tires screeching violently against the wet asphalt as it slid to a sudden chaotic halt right behind my pickup truck. The headlights cut through the driving rain, illuminating the tense scene on my front porch. The heavy car door flew open, and Todd stepped out into the pouring downpour. He was wearing a sharp tailored suit, his face twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He had obviously received Jessica's frantic text messages earlier and had sped straight over from his luxury downtown apartment, completely ready to use his smooth tongue, real estate credentials, and high society attitude to bully a helpless old man into submission. He marched up the front walkway with an aggressive, confident stride, completely ignoring the rain soaking his expensive clothes. He shouted out loud that this entire eviction was an illegal joke and that he was going to have the police officers stripped of their badges for participating in an unlawful lockout. He acted like he owned the entire neighborhood, projecting the toxic swagger of a man who believed his money made him completely untouchable. But as Todd reached the bottom of the porch steps, his entire demeanor completely froze. The smug, self-satisfied grin vanished instantly from his face as his eyes adjusted to the bright white beam of the police flashlights and the cold, authoritative presence of the two armed officers standing guard. His confident stride halted abruptly, his expensive Italian leather shoes stopping dead on the bottom concrete step. His gaze slowly traveled down to the wet floor of the porch, focusing directly on the scattered fraud documents waterlogged and splayed open under the amber light. Even in the dim lighting and the driving rain, he could clearly see the official letterheads he had fabricated. He saw the incorporation numbers of his anonymous Delaware shell company, highlighted in bright yellow ink right next to his own forged signatures. In a single terrifying heartbeat, Todd realized that the flawless, ironclad real estate scam he had engineered to rob my family had been entirely uncovered. His face lost every single drop of its color, turning a pale, sickening shade of gray. His broad shoulders slumped heavily, and his arms dropped to his sides. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but he could not produce a single coherent sound. He stood there trembling in the downpour, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming realization that his career, his wealth, his high society reputation, and his entire freedom had just evaporated into thin air. He knew better than anyone what federal bank fraud and identity theft charges meant. He knew he was looking at decades inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. Todd realized instantly his life was over. Kevin stood on the porch right beside the scattered papers, his eyes wide with a sudden, absolute panic as he watched his slick, brilliant brother-in-law completely fall apart in front of his eyes. All weekend long, Kevin had believed he was a master strategist, a wealthy visionary who had successfully outsmarted his obsolete father. He had relied entirely on Todd's arrogant assurances that their plan was legally bulletproof. Now he was watching his invincible shield crumble into a pathetic, terrified mess. The terrifying reality that their entire world had been completely obliterated over a single weekend finally crashed down onto my son's shoulders. He looked at the stern faces of the police officers who were watching them with quiet disgust. He looked down at the waterlogged fraud documents that contained his own complicit signatures. And then he looked up at me standing tall and secure inside the warm doorway of the home I had paid for with my own blood and sweat. The massive illusion of his unearned luxury, his beautiful beachfront vacation, and his perfect wealthy lifestyle completely vanished, leaving him with absolutely nothing. He was no longer a corporate executive. He was a common thief exposed in the rain, his knees physically buckled under the crushing weight of his own terror. Kevin dropped heavily onto the wet, muddy grass of the front lawn, his expensive tailored suit trousers soaking up the dirty, freezing rainwater. He collapsed, completely shedding any remaining shred of his false dignity. Real tears of pure, unadulterated terror began to stream down his face, mixing with the rain, as he buried his face in his shaking hands. He crawled forward a few inches in the mud, his hands stretching out toward the bottom of the porch steps in a desperate, pleading gesture. He began to sob hysterically, his voice cracking with a primal, desperate panic that echoed miserably through the quiet storm. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with sheer absolute terror as he begged for mercy. He screamed my name, calling me Dad over and over again. He cried out that he was my son, my only boy, my own flesh and blood. He pleaded with me to remember all the sacrifices we had made together, begging me not to do this to him. He cried that he had nowhere to go, that all his money was tied up in the Florida condo deposit, and that his bank accounts were going to be frozen. He clasped his hands together in the mud, shouting, "Dad, please, I am your son. You cannot put me on the street." I stood on the elevated porch and looked down at the weeping, broken man kneeling in the wet grass before me. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose high school graduations I had celebrated with tears of absolute pride. I remembered working double shifts through holidays and missing my own sleep just to make sure he had a warm bed and a full stomach. I waited to feel a spark of grandfatherly pity, a twinge of parental regret, or a single drop of the unconditional love that had defined my entire existence for 35 years. But inside my chest, there was nothing left but a cold, deep, vast silence. The heartbreak had turned to solid, unyielding iron long ago. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, righteous disgust for the creature who had stood in my living room just days ago and casually planned his own mother's demise. I leaned forward slightly, stepping right to the very edge of the porch, so the amber light caught the hard, sharp angles of my face. I looked directly down into his terrified, pathetic eyes and delivered the final, devastating blow that would end his charade forever. I told him in a voice that was dead flat, completely icy, and devoid of any human emotion, that the exact night he threw his sick mother out into the freezing rain, he stopped being my son. Kevin let out a loud, agonizing wail, clutching his chest as if the words had physically struck him. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I kept my voice perfectly steady, letting the absolute truth of his betrayal ring out clearly in the storm. I told him that a true son honors the woman who gave him life and protects the father who built his world. I looked at his expensive wet clothes covered in mud and told him that he was nothing to me now. I told him he was a trespasser, a predator, and a stranger. I raised my hand, pointing my calloused finger directly toward the end of the dark street. I commanded him with the absolute authority of a man who had reclaimed his kingdom to get off my property. The two police officers immediately stepped down from the porch, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. They moved toward the three broken figures in the rain, their voices loud and commanding, instructing them to vacate the premises immediately or face immediate arrest. I did not stay to watch them drag their heavy designer suitcases down the wet asphalt. I did not stay to listen to Jessica weeping or watch Todd stagger back to his sports car in a daze of impending federal doom. I turned around, stepped back into the warm, quiet sanctuary of my foyer, and pulled the heavy oak door completely shut. I turned the massive steel deadbolt, locking out the storm, the betrayal, and the monsters forever. I was finally home, and my beautiful Sarah was safe at last. 90 days have passed since that freezing torrential rainstorm washed the filth from my front porch. This morning, the Chicago sky broke open with a brilliant, blinding gold. I sat out on the front deck in my old wooden rocking chair, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sweet smell of freshly cut grass and early spring blossoms. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee, letting the heat spread evenly through my chest. For the first time in what felt like an absolute eternity, my shoulders were not tight with a heavy, suffocating anxiety. The dark, oppressive cloud that had hovered over this property for an entire year was completely gone. I looked back through the large bay window into the master bedroom on the first floor. We had converted the space into a beautiful, sunlit medical sanctuary for my wife. Sarah was awake, sitting up against a pile of plush, comfortable pillows, watching a morning cooking show. The doctors at the hospital had given me a grim, terrifying prognosis 3 months ago. They had spoken in those quiet, serious tones medical professionals use when they believe the end is rapidly approaching. But they were looking at a clinical chart, not a human soul. They did not understand that my beautiful Sarah was not dying from her illness. Her spirit was simply being crushed by the toxic, stressful environment my son had imposed upon our home. The very moment Kevin and Jessica were permanently barred from the property, the healing began almost overnight. The private medical suite gave her absolute comfort and dignity. The round-the-clock nursing care ensured she never had to strain herself. But the most important medicine of all was the profound, absolute quiet. There was no more yelling about suburban property values. There was no more loud, obnoxious dinner parties keeping her awake. There was no more fear. Yesterday morning, I put on one of Sarah's favorite old Motown records. The smooth, sweet sounds floated through the hallway, reaching her in the suite. I was in the kitchen preparing a big iron skillet of smothered pork chops and homemade cornbread. When I walked into her room carrying the tray, I saw her tapping her fingers against the bed rail, keeping perfect time with the music. The pale, grayish tint that had haunted her cheeks was entirely gone, replaced by a warm, healthy brown glow. Seeing the genuine light return to her eyes proved to me that every single brutal decision I had made was absolutely undeniably worth it. While absolute peace reigned inside our home, total legal devastation rained down upon the people who had conspired to destroy us. Abraham Sterling did not simply hand our evidence over to the local police precinct. He took the heavy leather binder filled with the original forged documents and walked it directly into the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal authorities do not play games with interstate wire fraud and fabricated corporate bankruptcies. They launched a swift, aggressive investigation into the anonymous Delaware shell company Todd had created. I will never forget the phone call I received from Abraham Sterling on the morning the federal agents moved in on Todd. I was sitting at the kitchen island when the phone rang. Abraham did not even say hello. He just let out a deep, rumbling laugh and told me to turn on the local news channel. I watched live helicopter footage as men in dark windbreakers carried dozens of heavy cardboard evidence boxes out of Todd's fancy high-rise office building. The feds had found a massive web of deceit stretching across 3 state lines. It turned out that my $92,000 retirement fund was not the only money Todd had stolen. He had been running this highly sophisticated predatory scam on several elderly minority clients for over 4 years. The physical copies I recovered from Kevin's wall safe were the exact smoking gun the federal prosecutors needed to break the entire enterprise wide open. Last Tuesday, a federal grand jury officially indicted Todd on 24 separate counts of aggravated wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. The slick, arrogant real estate broker who thought he could easily outsmart a retired city bus dispatcher was currently sitting in a federal holding facility without bail, looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 hard years in a federal penitentiary. As soon as the heavy federal indictments dropped, the perfect wealthy alliance between Kevin and Jessica shattered into a million jagged pieces. Jessica was a woman who was only loyal to luxury, status, and winning. The very second she realized her husband was facing serious criminal charges and total financial ruin, she abandoned ship with breathtaking speed. She did not stand by her man in his darkest hour. She hired a ruthless, aggressive divorce attorney and filed for an immediate dissolution of the marriage. She claimed in her legal filings that she was completely innocent, that she had absolutely no knowledge of the financial crimes her husband and her brother had committed. She threw Kevin directly to the wolves to save her own skin. She packed up her expensive designer clothes, drained whatever clean cash was left in their joint bank accounts, and moved back into her parents' upscale suburban home, leaving Kevin to face the music entirely alone. The poetic justice of her sudden betrayal was incredibly profound. Kevin had been willing to sacrifice his own sick mother just to please a woman who ultimately dropped him the exact moment he ceased to be financially useful. My son's entire world completely evaporated in the short span of 90 days. His prestigious corporate employer caught wind of the federal fraud investigation and terminated his executive contract immediately, citing a strict morality clause. His sleek imported luxury sports utility vehicle was repossessed in the middle of the night because he could no longer make the exorbitant monthly payments. With his bank accounts completely frozen by the federal authorities and the massive deposit on the Miami Beach condo entirely seized as criminal evidence, he had absolutely nowhere to go. The boy who used to sneer at my worn-out work boots and complain about the depressing middle-class suburban lifestyle was now living the ultimate nightmare he had tried to force upon my wife. I heard through the legal grapevine that Kevin is currently living in a cheap, run-down weekly motel on the far industrial edge of the city. To pay the massive retaining fees for his desperate criminal defense lawyers, he was forced to take a minimum wage job stocking heavy boxes on the overnight shift at a local discount warehouse. For 4 decades, I woke up at 4 in the morning to make sure the working-class people of Chicago could get to their jobs. I knew what real bone-deep exhaustion felt like. Kevin had always looked down on manual labor, believing that sitting in an air-conditioned office wearing a silk tie made him superior to the men who actually built this country. Now the universe had delivered a profound dose of poetic justice. I can picture him in that warehouse, his soft, manicured hands developing thick, painful blisters as he hauls heavy cardboard boxes onto wooden pallets. He spends his nights breaking his back for pennies, sweating under harsh fluorescent lights, completely stripped of his arrogant pride. Every single thing he valued: his status, his wealth, his beautiful wife, his expensive tailored suits. It was all gone. He traded his soul for a handful of stolen silver and ended up with absolutely nothing. He is finally learning the true value of $1, the exact hard way I had tried to teach him when he was a young boy. I sat in my old wooden rocking chair, watching a pair of blue jays dart across the vibrant green grass of the front lawn. I felt no joy in my son's misery. A father never truly wants to see his child fall into a dark abyss. But I also felt absolutely no regret. I had drawn a firm line in the sand to protect the most vulnerable, innocent person in my life. Kevin made his choices with a clear mind and a cold, calculating heart. He chose his dark path the night he decided my wife was a disposable inconvenience. He chose his bleak destiny when he manufactured a fake debt to steal the very money I had saved for his own inheritance. Building wealth as an African-American man in this country is a steep uphill battle. You fight for every single inch of ground. You save every spare penny, and you swallow a lot of pride just to secure a small piece of the American dream for your descendants. To see my own son eagerly conspire to strip away that hard-fought legacy simply to fund a lavish vacation lifestyle was a betrayal that cut deeper than bone. It was an insult to the generations before us who had absolutely nothing. I spent 40 long, grueling years of my life sitting in cramped dispatch rooms, keeping the heavy city buses running through ice storms and snow blizzards, just so my boy could have a better life. I gave him everything a father could possibly give. I gave him my hard-earned money, my secure home, my absolute trust, and my unconditional love. And he weaponized every single bit of it against me. But I refused to let my life's work become the spoils of his entitlement. I reclaimed my territory and secured my foundation. This painful journey taught me a harsh, ugly truth that many good people spend their entire lives trying to ignore. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones holding the knife. We are raised in our communities to believe that family is a sacred, unbreakable bond. We are conditioned to endure any disrespect, to swallow any insult, and to sacrifice our own mental peace just to keep the harmony around the holiday dinner table. But toxicity does not care about genetics. Greed does not care about a shared last name. Never hand over the keys to your life, your finances, or your spouse's safety to anyone while you are still breathing. You have to protect your house and your dignity at all costs. I learned the hard way that you cannot buy authentic loyalty, and you cannot fix a broken moral compass by simply writing another generous check. You must stand tall, you must fiercely guard your castle, and you must never ever let anyone convince you that your age makes you obsolete or defenseless. I took the last sip of my hot coffee as the bright morning sun finally cleared the tops of the neighborhood trees, casting a warm, beautiful golden light across the entire property. The morning air was calm. The neighborhood was quiet. My house was safe. My wife was smiling, and my heavy soul was finally completely at rest. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this old man's day. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next life story I share. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this video from and what time is it there right now? I am incredibly proud to know which corner of the country is listening to me. See you in the next story. With love and respect.